Chapter 61, Holy Ball of Fur. Over the past several hours, Percy had learned a lot more about the dynamic between his species and the natives of this world. While they were prohibited from touching him for any reason, he wasn't. He had approached and tapped the villagers many times over, always eliciting a smile from them. They seemed to see his presence as a good luck charm, treating him like a guest of honor, no, a sacred creature even. A bit weird, but I could get used to it. In any case, this only made his life easier. Between their overt friendliness and the fact he could survive on nothing but the brown fog, Percy was free to float around the village and observe it to his heart's content. Their understanding of magic was as poor as expected. They appeared to possess the same common affinities he was used to, although he hadn't seen them cast anything more complex than a crude spell. He also had no idea if they could be born with rare or composite affinities. Less than 1% of the population had them back on Remir. His sample size here was too small. Either way, Percy could see how they survived in such a hostile environment. Even though he'd spotted several green beasts on the way to the village, such a large group of yellow and orange mages shouldn't have much trouble taking care of themselves. He sighed. I suppose it's time to leave. As relaxing as it was floating around and being worshipped, Percy was confident there was nothing to gain here. He was about to wave the villagers farewell, when some commotion drew his attention. No harm in checking it out before I go. Flying above the crowd, he saw a distraught father carrying his unconscious daughter in his arms. She looked to be in her mid-teens, although Percy wasn't sure how well his preconceived notions about aging translated to this place. More importantly, the girl was afflicted with the worst instance of the disease he'd seen yet, her yellow core seemingly on the verge of dying out. The man hurriedly brought her to one of the largest huts, before kneeling by the entrance. He then spoke in an anxious tone, probably pleading with somebody. Okay. Color me intrigued. Percy wanted to watch how the natives mitigated the poison. Whatever they did was clearly nothing more than a half measure, as none of them were in perfect condition. Still, he'd be lying if he said he wasn't curious. Someone walked out of the house. An old lady. She was only at orange, but her core was among the healthiest he'd seen, despite her age. She held 2 small bowls, carved out of bone presumably. Leaving one on the ground, she tilted the girl's head up with her free hand, before placing the other bowl under her nose. A green liquid was swirling inside, emanating thick smoke of the same color. Some of it entered the teen's nostrils, as Percy paid closer attention, using both his regular sight and mana sense. Nothing changed in the girl's core, but she soon creased her brow as if in pain, before opening her eyes weakly a few moments later. That's not the cure. It was just to wake her up. The old lady picked up the second bowl again. This one contained a fine cyan powder. She spoke a few words to the girl, seemingly explaining something as she pointed first to the bowl and then to her stomach. Next, she gestured to a man in the crowd, who manifested a few drops of water above the powder. Nodding, the girl picked up the bowl, mixing the contents into paste with her fingers before swallowing it. What followed made Percy's eyes widen. He saw the mana flow from the girl's core to her stomach and then back, much like what he did on Remir whenever he used an elixir. But that's not what this is. The purpose of the paste was very different. Every time it washed over the core, the latter regained some of its luster. The change was minute, almost imperceptible. Percy would have certainly missed it if he wasn't actively looking for it. Even several minutes later, after she was done, the girl's situation had barely improved. Still, the tension on her forehead seemed to ease slightly. She was also able to stand, albeit with her father's support. They can't do anything to remove the poison, but they can mend some of the damage. The father and daughter both bowed their heads to the old lady, as the former said something in a somber tone. She didn't reply, but she made a gesture with her hand Percy didn't recognize, before returning to her hut. It didn't take long for the rest of the crowd to disperse. Now what do I do? Percy was reconsidering his decision to leave. Strictly speaking, all of this was irrelevant to him. The brown fog wasn't something they had to worry about back home. Furthermore, the effect of the cyan powder was quite underwhelming. He couldn't figure out what it did, nor did he know if it could be used for anything else. But that was exactly what made him want to learn more. This was the first thing the natives did he didn't fully understand. I must at least find out where they get it from. Having made up his mind, he descended next to the old lady's hut, peeking inside. It was a little creepy spying into her home like that, but he doubted she'd take offense. The woman was sitting on a piece of stone roughly shaped like a cube, sipping some orange broth from a cup. As expected, she only gave him a smile upon noticing him, not bothered by his intrusion in the slightest. If only I could fit through the door. Being larger than the rest of his kin, Percy's host was as tall as one of the adult villagers. However, he was much wider than them, his frame closer to a bear's than a cat's. Shrugging, he plopped down, taking a seat on the ground outside. He nearly rolled on his back too, just barely managing to grab the stone wall to keep himself upright. The old lady failed to stifle her laughter at his antics, choking on her soup as some came out of her nose. Percy rolled his eyes, but internally suppressed a chuckle of his own. He knew he looked ridiculous. Anyway, I'll stay here until I see where she gets the cyan powder from. Feeling a little peckish, he took a couple deep breaths, greedily sucking all the brown fog he could, savoring its flavor. A few minutes later, the air inside the hut already looked cleaner, as the old lady bowed her head in appreciation. She said something Percy didn't understand, although he did recognize some of the words of gratitude the girl's father had spoken earlier. "All right, I almost forgot I can help them like this." Percy made an odd expression. In theory, nothing stopped the locals from kidnapping a few of the furballs to lock in their houses. It wouldn't fix everything, but they could at least improve their quality of life that way. Would these people rather die than disrespect his kin? Well, I can do whatever the hell I want. Getting up, he took another deep breath before exhaling downward, taking off. A few minutes later, he returned to the village with two of his younger relatives in tow. The creatures didn't even struggle as he threw the first in the old lady's hut, before locating the sick girl's house and tossing the second one in there. Percy ignored the villagers cheering him on as he ascended again, repeating his actions a few more times. Only when he had stuffed a furball in each hut did he return to his spot by the old lady's entrance, clumsily sitting down again. More people surrounded him, eager to express their thanks. However, it wasn't their gratitude he wanted. Sadly, he didn't understand their language and he suspected he couldn't speak it anyway. His rotund frame made it difficult for him to relay his request via gestures too. Furthermore, it probably didn't help he was immune to the poison, thus having no reason to be interested in its remedy. I'll have to be patient until they show me what I need by themselves. Luckily, he didn't have to wait for long. Chapter 62, Crystal. It wasn't easy telling day and night apart on this world. Percy had no idea how many suns there were, as the brown clouds perpetually obscured the sky. Still, it was never dark, as the light seemed to be absorbed and then disseminated by the substance, giving it a permanent glow. Suffice to say, he didn't know how the natives kept track of time, but he guessed it was their equivalent of a night when he saw the old lady go to sleep on the floor, not long after he'd begun observing her. The rest of the village soon grew quieter too, as he turned around to show some common courtesy. He didn't think she'd mind being stared at, but it felt downright creepy to do that as she rested. Several hours later, people started waking up. What drew his attention was a young girl walking his way. She was actually the one who'd tried petting the furball when he first arrived here, only to be scolded by an adult. She seemed to have learned her lesson too, as this time she stood some distance from him, eyeing him curiously without daring to move closer. Feeling bad for the girl, Percy patted her head, prompting her to smile brightly, two dimples forming on her cheeks. A few minutes later, more kids arrived. This time it was a pair of boys, slightly older than the girl. Probably siblings too, as they'd come together from the same house and looked identical to one another. In fact, Percy was being conservative. He was confident they were twins, but maybe he wasn't that good at telling the natives apart. In any case, they joined the first girl outside the hut. Soon, the old lady also woke up, inviting them all inside. All four of them sat down on the floor, forming a circle. It was quite cramped in there, especially with the cat creature floating just inches above their heads. But they still left enough room for one more person. Nobody spoke as they waited for the final member to arrive. It wasn't until half an hour later that the man from last night helped his daughter along, escorting her to the old lady's hut once more. Only after the teenager joined the others in the circle did her father leave. Is she teaching them how to become healers? This suited Percy just fine, as he looked forward to the lesson. After exchanging a few words with the newcomer, the old lady addressed the rest of the kids. Next, she pulled some mana from her core, forming a cyan blob in her hand. The students followed her lead, although the sick girl seemed to have more trouble controlling her mana. Despite having the highest grade in the hut, her condition wasn't doing her any favors. However, this wasn't what Percy was focused on. They all have a pure affinity. He'd rub his paws together if he could, doubling his concentration. His gaze locked onto the old lady's palm, unwilling to miss whatever she was about to do. Her first move was to will the blob into a solid, forming a cyan sphere the size of a tangerine. Percy nodded. This wasn't very different from his own constructs. However, what she did next made him furrow his brow. She placed her other hand on top of the ball, and then began pressing them both together, trying to squeeze the sphere tighter. The kids also mirrored her actions, but he didn't pay them any attention, preferring to learn from the expert. The strangest part was that Percy wasn't exactly sure what she was doing. Her muscles were tense and her face red, suggesting some level of physical activity. Yet, her core was also shining a touch more brightly, which typically happened when somebody was using their mana to form a spell. She's exerting both physical strength and willpower. At first nothing changed, making Percy wonder whether they were pulling his leg. However, a minute or two later he noticed the sphere had shrunk somewhat. It contained the same amount of mana as before, but it was denser. The old lady kept going. She was already drenched in sweat, but her focus didn't waver. She was probably used to doing this. Over time, the ball continued to shrink, until it was roughly half its original size an hour later. Only then did she stop, letting the ball roll out of her hand. The marble made a crisp sound as it hit the floor, bouncing once before rolling to the center of the circle. What the hell? It's stable. In his experience, whenever he stopped paying attention to his constructs, they instantly crumbled into motes of mana before dissipating. But that wasn't what happened here. The old lady had already forgotten all about the ball, as she was talking to her students, pointing out their mistakes. Yet, the sphere was sitting idly on the floor, giving no signs of breaking anytime soon. How does that even make sense? Our cores already contain denser mana, yet it doesn't crystallize like that. The old lady only had an orange core, an injured one at that. Her mana capacity couldn't compare to a yellow, let alone a violet or white, so why did the substance transform this way just by being compressed by about 50%? Thinking back to her actions, Percy tried to figure out what she had done to cause this. She had first pulled the mana out of her sternum, manifesting the cyan blob in her hand. At that point, it was still in its fluid state, as that was how mana was stored in one's core. When in that state, mana could be compressed countless times, which was essentially the difference between different grades. By purifying their core, mages reinforced it, allowing it to withstand more pressure and store denser mana. But she created a construct before squeezing it. After turning into a solid, the mana resisted the compression more strongly, requiring a lot more effort for even the tiniest deformation. The old lady had probably done this her whole life, yet she'd still needed an hour before the crystal was stable. Percy's attention returned to the kids. It had taken them longer than their teacher, yet most of their spheres had barely shrunk by 20%, a far cry from their goal. The younger girl was actually the best, but even she had only compressed hers by about 25%. All of them were breathing heavily too, their hands shaking. One of the boys was the first to make a mistake, his sphere shattering into a cloud of dust. Percy almost thought he had made it, but the powder faded away into nothing not long after. The rest of the kids soon followed, none of them leaving behind much evidence of their efforts. other than a shallow pool of sweat by their seat. After giving them a couple minutes to catch their breath, the old lady spoke to them in a consoling tone, seemingly giving them a few words of advice. Only then did she remember the marble on the floor, picking it up before flicking it a couple of times with her fingernail. It made crisp sounds, but showed no signs of breaking, making the children nod in appreciation as Percy considered the implications. It looks like it takes a lot of effort to learn, but it could be worth my time. If I can form my constructs out of this crystal, I can make them a lot strong. He didn't even get a chance to complete that thought when the old lady smashed the ball with a rock, splitting it in two. She then tossed the pieces in a bowl, before proceeding to crush them both into powder. Okay, scratch that. It's useless in a fight. Perhaps the crystal was slightly harder than his regular constructs, maybe not, but it was certainly extremely brittle. Even if Percy ignored the effort required to create it, he doubted his weapons would take more than a hit or two before breaking. It won't be easy to repair them either. With his hopes dashed, he had no choice but to keep watching the lesson to its end. The old lady continued to mercilessly pound the crystal for a while longer, until she was left with a pile of the same sigh and powder he had seen before. She then picked up an oblong piece of bone from the corner of the room. It was hollowed out, looking a bit like a vase. She poured a few drops of water into the bowl, before handing it to the sick girl. The teenager then mixed the powder into paste once more, before repeating her actions from the previous night. Half an hour later, the old lady said a few more words to her students before sending them on their merry way. I guess they can't make enough powder to keep up with everyone's poison. Even if every person with a pure affinity learned to do this as proficiently as the old lady, it wouldn't be enough. In any case, Percy fully intended to observe for a few more days. He had a hunch this trick could help him with alchemy back home. Unfortunately, he had no way of knowing what repercussions this decision would have on his main body. Chapter 63, Emergency. This was going to be the one. Percy had already preserved enough of the nectar through both pacification and redirection. In fact, deattunement was going great too. Just a couple more minutes and he'd finish brewing his first drops of elixir. Suddenly, he felt the ethereal cord tense, his consciousness nearly sinking into his familiars. He resisted. Percy had grown somewhat better at handling the episodes after nearly a year in the guild. Still, the mixture boiled over, as the few remaining drops of elixir began to dwindle. Even a couple moments of inattention were more than enough to ruin his efforts. Percy tried his best to salvage some of it, but only slop remained in the cauldron. Are you sure you're okay? Orin asked in concern. Your illness has lasted a lot longer this time. The old alchemist had stopped supervising his attempts for the past few months, letting him experiment and learn by himself. However, he'd resumed observing him recently, as his sponsorship was nearing its end, and he wanted to evaluate his students' progress, as well as offer some final advice. Yeah, it's going to pass sooner or later, Percy said. If you want, I've got a friend with a blue core and a life affinity in the guild. I can ask him to give you a checkup. Orin didn't relent. Thank you, sir, but it won't be necessary. We have plenty of those in my house and none of them could do anything about my situation, he replied vaguely. Orin creased his brow but didn't insist. They bid each other farewell before parting for the night. What is that clone doing? Percy wondered on the way to his place. It had been gone for over a week. Of course, he knew this was technically a good thing. It meant he'd finally stumbled upon something interesting enough to warrant looking into. Percy had been over the moon when he first realized his latest venture was a success. That said, the delay was really screwing with both his alchemy and hunting in the meantime. Entering his house, Percy was about to take a shower when the connection pulled him again. Instinctively, he fought back, but a wave of powerful thoughts and emotions also seeped through the bond. Caw! Caw! Mickey was distraught, afraid, in pain. Panicking, Percy was tempted to peer through the crow's eyes, to see what was happening. Still, he didn't want to interfere with his familiar in case he was fleeing from something. Without wasting a moment, he grabbed all the healing potions in his room, clumsily splitting them into his pockets, hoping the cheap vials wouldn't break. Next, he bolted out of his house, sprinting towards the spire, ignoring the soreness and exhaustion. "Mickey, what's going on?" "Caw." The bird couldn't spare him much attention, but it still managed to relay some fragmented images. A figure in a yellow robe, stones flying, an injured wing. Mickey hadn't given him much, but it was enough. Percy already knew where the familiar tended to nest for the night. "Hold on. I'm on my way. Try to escape towards me." Despite his reassuring words, he was a lot more conflicted internally, however. Shit. What do I even do in this situation? Percy had no idea what madness had driven the Yellow Corps to roam the first level so late at night, nor what stroke of misfortune had caused him to attack his familiar. Still, technically that person hadn't done anything wrong. Sometimes, other beasts besides the starry wasps wandered into the fungal spire, and there weren't any rules against killing them. But if Percy harmed him, he'd be the one in trouble. Even if he came clean with his secrets and explained the situation to the guild's management, he doubted it would solve much. Mickey might not be a regular beast, but the truth was in many ways worse. He was a member of a foreign race that Percy had smuggled into Remir. Some might even consider it an act of treason. They wouldn't take kindly to him attacking a member of the guild, a native, over such a creature. Percy shook his head. What am I even thinking? It doesn't matter what the consequences are. Mickey wasn't just a beast, or an alien, or a creature. He was his friend, his family. By the time he'd resolved himself to doing whatever it took, Percy was outside the settlement. Ignoring the bridge leading up to the second level, he ran towards Mickey while activating circulation. "Are you still there? What's the situation?" "Caw." Mickey's thoughts were sluggish. He was desperately fleeing from his pursuer, but he couldn't fly very high nor very fast. Every beat of his wings hurt, and he felt cold, having lost a lot of blood. At least, the yellow guy didn't seem to be in a hurry, only leisurely chasing the bird, knowing it wouldn't get very far. Percy gritted his teeth, picking up the pace. He might have decided to do whatever he could to save his friend, but he had yet to settle on his best course of action. "I can't handle a Yellow Corps in a direct fight." As things stood, he only had two viable options. He could try reasoning with that person, getting him to back off peacefully. This was the most civilized approach, but also a rather shitty one. There were many details he'd have to gloss over while negotiating, and he had no idea what the other party's personality was like. If the talks failed, he'd be giving up the element of surprise. The other option was a sneak attack. It had worked in the past, but there was no guarantee it would again, especially given the circumstances. Having freshly sent out a clone, Percy still had some trouble regenerating soul mana by himself. Mickey was in no condition to help either. Perhaps he could gather enough for a parting gift in the next few minutes, but that would limit him to a single shot. If he missed, he'd be screwed, and it would be too late for negotiations. "I can give circulation another try." He'd already failed to find the correct pattern for his soul affinity countless times, but there was still some distance from Mickey, so he could afford another attempt. Intensifying his breaths, he began filling his first core. His injuries pulled the mana, trying to pry it from his control, and he let them. As the mana flowed into his channels, the newly formed vacuum enhanced his ability to draw more from the air, as the colorful motes swirled into his body even more forcefully. Soon, an equilibrium was reached, with mana flowing both into and out of his sternum at equal measures, as the hole in his soul began to fill up. This lasted until the injury was saturated. It needed some time to absorb the mana, which caused the drain on his core to weaken temporarily. Still, Percy didn't allow it, continuing to push the mana into his channels, this time intentionally directing it along the latest pattern he had devised. Locating the correct pathways inside the mess was tricky, but he managed to get a grip on them eventually. At first, things were going all right, as the soul mana flowed through his soul unobstructed, his body and mind strengthening. However, the channels soon drifted again, making him almost mess up, nearly sending the mana down the wrong pathway. Gritting his teeth, he adjusted his control, focusing on maintaining the correct pattern as the channels continued to shift around. I won't be able to fight like this. Percy would have to constantly pay attention inwards to keep the technique up. It wasn't practical, but he didn't want to give up just yet. Sadly, he made a mistake a few moments later. Having missed a connection, he sent the mana down the wrong turn, causing the entire flow to collide against itself. An entire section of his soul swelled near his right shoulder, causing some tears to form, as an excruciating wave of agony washed over him. Argorg! Percy stumbled, falling on the ground before rolling a dozen meters in the dirt. Still, he didn't let go of his control just yet, trying to restore the correct pattern. However, another complication emerged. The soul mana now wanted to flood the newly formed cracks, creating a third flow to compete against the other two. And it all went downhill from there. More clashes occurred, causing more injuries and just as many rogue flows of mana, soon forcing him to relinquish the technique before it led to irreparable damage. It was worth a shot, he smiled wryly. Pushing himself up, he resumed running towards Mickey, allowing part of the mana to flood the new injuries as he gathered the rest in his core. At least he had enough for the parting gift now. A few minutes later, he finally caught a glimpse of his familiar, flying in an irregular path towards him. In fact, it might be more accurate to say it was leaping from tree to tree, inadvertently banking to his injured wing with each beat. I'm here. Bait him over. Percy ignored Mickey for now, hiding behind the nearest tree, pulling a trickle of soul mana into his eyes, sending the rest to his hand. He felt the sickle form, as the pursuer's silver silhouette casually approached the bird. Just a little closer. Percy didn't bother circling around the tree, instead launching the sickle through it. He held his breath as the blade spun soundlessly through the air. It was about to hit its mark. At the last second, the pursuer was startled, clumsily leaping out of the way. He only had enough time to move slightly, the sickle still carving a nasty groove on his upper arm. The man fell down, clutching his injury. However, before Percy had the chance to celebrate, his enemy was back on his feet. This time, he was looking his way. Through mana sense, Percy spotted 3 yellow masses gathering in the air next to the man, taking the form of spears, pointing towards the tree. The sneak attack had failed. Chapter 64, Maelstrom. The spears pierced through the tree like it was made of cotton, barely giving Percy a chance to dodge. But his trouble had just begun, as more yellow mana gathered under his feet. Tilting his body at the last second, he narrowly escaped impalement, though not without a gnarly gash on his upper thigh. If this had been higher up on the spire, his opponent wouldn't be able to manifest his earth constructs through the surface of the giant fungi. Sadly for Percy, the ground on the first floor was made of dirt and rock. At least, Mana Sense gave him the chance to react a fraction of a second early, but even with circulation, keeping up with a yellow core was a tall order. What the hell gave you the confidence to attack me? And what's up with the weird mana flow around your abdomen? The man asked without pausing. Percy was too preoccupied trying to survive the barrage of javelins to reply. Another 2 landed next to his feet, almost pinning him in place. Luckily, he'd managed to step out of their path just in time. I can't keep this up forever. Squarely at a disadvantage, he tried dodging backwards whenever possible in a desperate attempt to put some distance between them. It would give him more time to react, not to mention giving his familiar an opening to escape. However, even the physical capabilities of his opponent eclipsed his own, letting him casually keep up with him while continuing his relentless onslaught. Shit. Mickey can't help. The quarterstaff will snap like a twig. The glove might as well be made of paper. I can't close the distance for a physical blow either. A javelin brushed over his head. It would have stabbed through his skull if he hadn't ducked. The Earth Mage made the next one pop up from the ground at an angle, leaving another deep cut right under Percy's ribs. Ag! Returning to the guild wasn't an option either. It was too far to outrun him. Percy gritted his teeth. Soul mana was the only thing that could save him, but it took too long to recover normally. Still, realizing it was only a matter of time until he made a fatal mistake, he took a deep breath, not giving the mana a chance to settle in his core before pushing it into his channels. He didn't even bother trying to control where it went this time. He couldn't. Most of his attention was glued to his opponent. His only option was to let it rampage freely until he had enough for another sickle. A javelin headed for his eye. This one Percy saw too late. He tried parrying with his backhand. The glove shattered on impact, blood splattering from his left hand as the bones inside cracked, sending a visceral wave of pain through his body. Percy suppressed a groan as he continued to evade whatever he could, trying to minimize the damage. Several seconds later, enough mana had gathered in his channels to begin clashing with itself. Tears formed on his soul, the new surge of agony utterly dwarfing that of his physical wounds. But he didn't stop it. He didn't have the luxury to grab a hold of the flow or to delay the accumulation. If he failed to craft his weapon, he was done for regardless. The flow shifted towards the new cracks, putting more strain on his soul. Just a little more. Wherever the mana clashed, more tears opened. Each fresh wound created its own flow, in a vicious cycle that could only end in a horrific death. Percy was too absorbed to care. He dodged spear after spear, the cuts continuing to accumulate on his flesh every time he made a mistake. Some were shallow, others deeper, as both his body and soul were on the verge of collapse. At this point, he couldn't even keep track of how much mana he had gathered. Maybe it was enough for the sickle, maybe not. He lacked the mental capacity to form the spell anyway. He could only keep evading. Soon, his vision became a blur. He couldn't make out his surroundings, and his heartbeats dominated his hearing. The only thing he had left was mana sense, barely providing him enough information to keep dodging by the skin of his teeth. The mana still raged in his channels. By now, he couldn't stop the flow even if he wanted. It rampaged ceaselessly through his soul, tearing and repairing it with each violent gale. Percy wasn't sure he was even alive anymore. He hoped his muscles still responded to his input, but he couldn't feel them. By now, he struggled to even remember the shape of his body. For a second, he even forgot where he was, almost thinking he was another clone trying to possess somebody else. The ethereal cord tightened, his consciousness nearly stripped out of his head. Luckily, he was still lucid enough to resist. If he let this happen now, his death would be guaranteed. No, I must stay in my own body. He succeeded, his opponent's yellow core coming into focus once again, as he sidestepped another construct. It was a little slower. Is he finally tired? Something new appeared in his vision. Surrounding the yellow glow in the man's body, a silver silhouette gradually formed. Soul vision? I don't remember activating it. More spears. Some flew directly towards him. Others tried to block his escape. A few stabbed from the ground up, in all sorts of insidious angles, trying to catch him unprepared. Percy dodged one after another. Fewer scraped him than before. Soon, he noticed something interesting. Right before each attack, the silhouette changed. Silver flicker. Yellow glow. Dodge. Javelin. Another flicker. Another glow. Dodge again. Spear. I can begin dodging before the glow. Silver flicker. Dodge. A yellow glow. The spear changed trajectory at the last second, but evading it was still easier than before. This time, the silver silhouette wavered. He was surprised. Percy didn't care, he just continued dodging as best as he could. The man's intent betrayed his actions before they were complete. The spells grew slower too. At some point, dodging them was effortless. Another new sensation took root in Percy's mind. His hearing. But it wasn't regular sound. Howls of pain. It was his own soul screaming at him in agony. Only then did he remember what he was doing. He tossed a fleeting glance at his body. The sight shocked him. His soul thrummed in a bright silver, raging torrents rampant through his channels. New tiers kept forming. His pathways kept shifting. The flow randomly changed, never remaining constant for longer than a moment. Like a maelstrom, Percy's eyes widened in horror. How am I still alive? He dodged another couple of spears before checking his soul again. More tears formed each second, but they were tiny. Every time the potent mana washed over them, they disappeared. At some point, he'd began to out-heal the damage, to the point the injuries only managed to change the flow before fading. He grinned, shifting his attention to his opponent. Another spear stabbed through the ground. Percy tilted his head slightly to avoid it. A torrent of mana gushed to his hand, forming the parting gift. It was twice as large as it normally was. The silver silhouette trembled. One more spear pierced underneath Percy, but he was ready for it. Falling forward, he let it stab the air behind him, before kicking it with his right foot. Propelling himself, he dashed towards his opponent, with 2 types of mana empowering his body. More javelins formed. Some stabbed at him directly, others tried to cut him off. They all missed. Percy stepped around them, weaving and pivoting and dancing. "Please, don't," a shaky voice begged. However, the sickle sliced soundlessly through the air without stopping. And just like that, a soul was cleaved in half. As soon as the lifeless body hit the ground, Percy wanted to plop down himself. But there were things he needed to do first. "Mickey?" No reply. They had put some distance from the familiar during the fight, and he should have passed out from his injuries. Percy felt the crow's location through the cord, before tossing the corpse on his shoulder and running towards it. While moving, he threw his body another glance. Both his flesh and soul were covered in nasty wounds from head to toe. Fortunately, the adrenaline combined with 2 instances of circulation gave him enough energy to stand. For now at least. He reached for the healing potions in his pockets. Ouch! He tried again after covering his hands with cyan gloves, grabbing a pile of wet shards. Only one of the vials had survived, the rest having shattered during the fight. In hindsight, it wasn't that surprising considering even his robes were in tatters. Reaching the crow, he pushed a crap load of soul mana through the connection. Waking it up, he drank half the potion before feeding the rest to the bird. It wasn't that potent, but they'd have to share given the circumstances. "Eat him," he said, carelessly tossing the body on the ground. Even ignoring how valuable a yellow core was, they had to get rid of all the evidence of what happened. Percy hadn't forgotten he'd just committed a serious crime. As the bird feasted on the corpse, Percy searched the man's possessions for anything of value. He found a pouch containing about a dozen elixirs and a couple thousand contribution points. Next, he buried everything else a few meters deep by the time Mickey was done. Only a third of the corpse had been consumed, the bird not being large enough to devour the whole thing in one sitting. He'd have to finish the rest tomorrow. The 2 found the nearest tree, before plopping down at its base. Their situation was still precarious given the partially eaten body and the hundreds of stone spears littering their surroundings. If somebody stumbled upon them, they'd get in a world of trouble. However, neither of them could summon enough strength to clean up right now. They'd have to do so in the morning, assuming the potion did its job. Chapter 65, Aftermath. Beasts tended to heal fast. Between drinking half the healing potion and consuming a fresh yellow core, Mickey was all right by morning. Percy, on the other hand, not so much. "I suppose I'm in better shape than the other guy," he consoled himself, looking at the half-eaten corpse of his enemy. At least he wasn't dead or in chains. Percy had never been more grateful for the desolation on the lower levels than he was in that moment. His wounds had stopped bleeding too, so he wasn't in any immediate danger. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed against the tree to stand up, before walking to the nearest stone javelin. He only activated circulation with his weaker core, as he wasn't in the mood to start tearing his soul again. His channels still burned, but he needed the extra boost to crush the constructs to dust. And there were plenty of them. "Mickey, you must eat the rest of the body. Do whatever you have to, but it needs to be gone by the afternoon. CAW. The crow wasn't pleased, as the remains were already devoid of mana, but it accepted the assignment without complaint. Percy stomped the first spear to powder, before moving to the next one. There were hundreds in the area where they had fought, plus he'd have to retrace the guy's steps from when he was chasing Mickey. The bastard had paced himself well, launching the projectiles about as fast as he recovered his mana. Even without circulation, he'd unleashed a lot of attacks without tapping out. It was already dark again by the time Percy was done. He'd destroyed most of the evidence of the battle, and Mickey had eaten the last traces of the corpse. They'd even looked for any lingering bloodstains, burying them underground. If somebody passed through the area in the next couple of days, the freshly dug dirt might look suspicious, but they couldn't do much about that, other than letting time take care of it. Another problem was the tree the Earth Mage had pierced through at the beginning of the scuffle. Percy couldn't make the whole thing disappear, so his next best move had been to cut it in half and trim the trunk. At least, that way it wouldn't be so obvious what had damaged it. It was probably overkill, but he didn't know if somebody was familiar with the guy's magic. I wonder what Oren is thinking. This was his first time missing an alchemy session in the past 5 months. He'd have to make up a story by tomorrow, but he doubted his mentor would suspect he'd spent the day covering up a murder. Then, there was the issue with his current appearance. Between his battered body and tattered clothes, he needed a believable excuse before returning to the settlement. Fortunately, the bandage wrapped around his abdomen still seemed to work, despite a few holes here and there. At least, Mickey couldn't detect the second core through mana sense. Caw. Next, the bird led him to a pile of starry drones. He'd hunted them on his own while Percy was busy clearing the evidence. Not for the contribution points, of course. They'd already decided to take it easy for the next few days. No, they needed the dead wasps for something else. This is going to suck so much. Ripping a strip of fabric from his robes, Percy rolled it up before placing it in his mouth. He bit down, holding a carcass over a wound on his arm. Next, he squeezed its abdomen, causing a drop of purple liquid to drip down from the stinger, splashing along the cut. SSSS. A sharp pain instantly assaulted him as he watched his own flesh sizzle and blacken. Intentionally pouring acid into his injuries wasn't something he'd ever imagined doing, but he had to make them look like they'd been inflicted by the bugs. Percy's body had gone through a lot of torture over the past day, but his mind wasn't faring much better. Even now, he couldn't help but second-guess his decisions. Was this really the best course of action? The guy he'd killed wasn't a bandit like Rick, just a fellow member of the guild, hunting on the fungal spire. An innocent person. Percy had attacked without even trying to communicate first. He'd done that to maintain the element of surprise, but the sneak attack had failed anyway. He didn't regret doing his best to save his familiar, but he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened had he given that person a chance. Even if negotiations had led nowhere, the fight would have pretty much developed in the same way. But what if he'd agreed to let Mickey go? Sure, Percy would have still ended up in a difficult situation, with another person knowing at least one of his secrets. That said, it wasn't necessarily worse than worrying about his crime being discovered. I guess I'll never know. It was past midnight by the time he finished mutilating his wounds. Percy was glad he didn't have a mirror on him, as he was too scared to look at his body. At least, there wouldn't be too many people awake in the settlement right now. Hopefully, he wouldn't meet anybody besides the guards. Gods, what happened to you? One of the men asked. Percy scratched his head. I was an idiot. I heard of a place with starry soldiers on the second level, and I was dumb enough to try fighting them. The two gave him incredulous expressions. Hunting yellow beasts with an orange core. What madness possessed you to do that? Kid, you're lucky to be alive. Percy chuckled bitterly. He then tried walking through the gate, but one of them stepped in his way, blocking his path. Outwardly, Percy gave him a questioning look, but internally he was sweating buckets, afraid he'd overlooked something. The guy didn't seem to notice, however. Instead, he searched his pocket before handing Percy a vial. Use this. I've had this for ages, but I doubt it will do me much good. It might work better on you. It's a healing potion. Percy was moved. He was already planning to buy a few tomorrow to fix his body, but the sooner he began recovering, the less unwanted attention he'd draw to himself. He looked for some change in his pouch when the guard stopped him. It's on me, kid. Just try to be more careful out there. Thanks. Percy nodded in appreciation before downing the green liquid on the spot. He felt his wounds itch for a few seconds, already looking a bit better by the time the effect wore off. Luckily, he saw nobody else on the way home. All the stands had already closed for the night. Not that he didn't crave his daily honey roll. Percy was practically starving, but he'd rather not give Freddy a heart attack. Reaching his house, he first stopped by his preservation box, stuffing his face with anything edible he found. Only then did he enter the shower, still chewing on a slice of cheese. Peeling what remained of his robes was painful, the fabric already stuck to his wounds in several spots. Many scabs fell out, making him wince. Washing the acid off his injuries wasn't much better. The good news is I have another set of robes. It had cost him 200 points, a hefty sum, most likely due to the self-cleaning enchantments inscribed on the garments. Still, given his secrets, he'd decided it was worth investing in some spare clothes in case of an emergency. Thank Phoebe too. He wouldn't have to walk around naked tomorrow. If I wake up at sunrise, I can get to the official shop as soon as it opens. He'd give the clerk the same excuse as the guards, if she asked, and patch his body up with another potion or two. By then, he'd look as good as new. That way nobody else would see his wounds. He'd only have to repeat his story twice more, to Orin and maybe Freddy, before returning to his routine. Overall, he was happy with his odds of getting away with it. Murder was a serious crime in the guild, but only if he got caught. Nobody ever bothered checking up on people. The chances anyone would notice the yellow core was missing were abysmal. Not to mention somebody going out looking for him. And on the first floor of all places. Beyond that, it would all come down to Percy's luck. Chapter 66, Hemeraka. Having been around for nearly 2 weeks, number 13 was Percy's longest-lived clone so far, at least in terms of time inside a body. Of course, he still fell a little short compared to his predecessor's trip on Hue, but most of that guy's days had been spent shopping for a host, so they hardly counted. Either way, Percy confirmed once more that his clones were inherently unstable. No matter how peacefully he possessed their bodies or how much soul mana he invested, they wouldn't last long before collapsing. Perhaps it also depended on the circumstances of their deaths. At least when it came to old age, there was only so much he could do to stretch their remaining lifespan. Consequently, his time observing the primitive village was also nearing its end. Not that there's much more to learn here. The crystallization technique was straightforward. Percy had only needed a couple days to understand how it was performed and what the effects of the cyan powder were. Essentially, it was a matter of exerting one's control over mana to compress the constructs into a denser state. The locals used their physical strength to supplement their willpower, something he would have an easier time doing due to his second core and circulation. That said, this component wasn't necessary. Advancing to a higher grade would naturally make the technique easier, so he estimated he would eventually be able to perform it without getting his hands dirty. Sadly, this simply wasn't an option for the locals. Either way, the rest of his time had been spent estimating how long he'd need to master the art. It was an important data point that would determine whether it was worth focusing on this once he returned home, or whether he was better off waiting until he advanced. And the results were mixed. The kids have barely improved since I got here. At this rate, it'll easily take me a year. Maybe longer. His only consolation was that he was both more hardworking and healthier than the local children, giving him some hope of integrating the cyan powder into his alchemy before it was time to leave the guild. Percy had also grown a little fond of the locals. Every world he had ever experienced had its own share of hardships, but he'd never met anybody as pitiful as these people. The very air they breathed was poison. The sick girl's situation in particular was a true tragedy. Born at Yellow, she would have enjoyed a long and comfortable life in most places. Here, she was destined to die before reaching adulthood. At least these people are kind. If this had been any noble house on Remier, her tribemates would have written her off as a hopeless case and left her alone to die a long time ago. But that wasn't what the villagers had done. They seemed to have a policy of devoting all their cyan powder to the person who needed it the most. Many others were also sick, but the old lady kept all her efforts focused on the girl. Not that it helped much. "Hemeraka!" her father shouted when she collapsed again. That was the girl's name, as Percy had come to learn. Despite everyone's sacrifices, her episodes had grown both more frequent and more severe. At this point, he wasn't sure if his host would die before she did. The man brought her to the old lady's hut once more. However, the healer was at a loss. The green concoction was no longer enough to wake the girl up, and she couldn't use the powder if she was unconscious. A gloomy mood overcame the small village as a crowd gathered around them. Nobody spoke, but the children's cries and even the occasional sobs of the adults broke the somber silence. As Hemuraka's breath slowed down and whatever was left of her core began to dim, her father grew even more desperate. Grabbing his daughter, he began shaking her, trying to wake her up. Another person had to intervene to stop him. H. The grieving father's guttural scream was the most heart-wrenching sound Percy had heard in any of his lives. Someone patted the man's back, trying to console him. He didn't react. He just stared at his unconscious daughter, his body trembling. He was either unwilling to miss her final moments or unable to accept they were forthcoming. Suddenly, he stopped shaking. Raising his head, the man looked at Percy. His eyes were bloodshot, a crazy glint shining in his pupils. But there was something else there too. Hope. Leaping to his feet, the father sprinted towards him, before falling to his knees right underneath the floating clone. Sakar el Deakin. Deakin! He screamed, his voice cracking. Percy didn't understand the words, of course, but it wasn't that hard to infer their meaning. Is there anything I can do? Truth be told, he still didn't know the full extent of his species' abilities. Could they do more than just filtering the air? The old lady soon approached the man, trying to pull him away. He resisted. Deakin! Deakin! He kept yelling. He knocked his head on the ground over and over, a trickle of blood flowing down his forehead, mixing with tears on his chin. The sight made Percy wince, especially considering these people had an eye on their foreheads. Exhaling, Percy floated down, gently stopping him with his paw. He then made his way to the girl. Her life was already hanging by a thread. Percy had no idea if he could help, but what was there to lose? Worst case scenario, I fail. Both of us are dying anyway. Patting Hemuraka's arm, he quickly noted it was cold. He already knew her sternum was filled with the brown mist. The question was how to get it out of her core. Any insight you're willing to share? Percy asked his host. The original owner of his body had remained silent over the past 2 weeks. He wasn't sure if he was still even there. Against all odds, a response came through. Foreign thoughts soon crossed Percy's mind. He suddenly had some idea of what he was supposed to do. All right, here goes nothing. Looking at the girl's father who'd already joined him by now, he gestured for him to open his daughter's mouth. He then lowered his own, before softly inhaling, focusing his mana sense on her core. Nothing happened. Percy drew a second breath and then a third, in a desperate race against time. Every moment risked being Hemuraka's last. A dark wisp emerged. It was the thickest, deepest brown he'd seen since coming to this world. It was even denser than the clouds above, or the vents spewing the poison into the air. Another wisp followed, as the girl's core stopped dimming. A wet cough escaped her throat, as a viscous sludge splattered all over Percy's face. Part of him flinched, wanting to move away from the discharge. Another part of him, however, the one stemming from his host's instincts, prodded him to remain in place. If the brown fog tasted like strawberry juice, the sticky liquid was more akin to strawberry jam, its flavor heavenly to his alien taste buds. I'm not sure if this is the best thing I've ever eaten, or the most gross. Probably both. Either way, the girl kept improving the more of the substance he extracted from the core, as the yellow light burned brighter with every breath. Ha 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 ha! The father burst into joyous laughter, as the rest of the villagers erupted into cheers. A few minutes later, Hemuraka had the healthiest core he had seen since coming here, but Percy didn't stop just yet. If I'm going to do this, I might as well clean it up completely. He kept going until the core was restored to over 80% of its full capacity, when something unexpected happened. Amidst the bright yellow glow, a faint green strand emerged, causing Percy to raise an eyebrow. as the locals gasped and exclaimed in awe. "Don't tell me!" Intensifying his efforts, he took breath after breath. As more poison was sucked out of the girl's core and more strands of green appeared, one after another, until they began to dominate. By the time Hemaraka coughed out the last drop of sludge out of her throat, a green core thrummed with power in her chest. Holy shit! The poison must contain beast mana. It clearly wasn't pure like the nectar they had on Remir, as even the beasts he'd encountered were suffering from the poison. His species were the only ones equipped to fully process the substance. The mana was also rather thin, as it wasn't visible through mana sense. Still, it had to be there, as that was the only explanation for Hemaraka's advancement. "Kara's dim lot," the man said, drawing Percy's attention. His daughter soon echoed his words. Nodding, Percy then looked at the rest of the villagers, noticing all their eyes were sparkling as they gazed at him. He chuckled. "Oh well, I suppose I still have a few hours left."
Chapter 67
It took Percy several more hours to cure the rest of the villagers. Not all of them advanced like the girl, but many did, especially the older ones or those with the most poison accumulated in their cores. By now, Percy was in a lot of pain, his host's soul already beginning to crumble. He had to keep shifting his soul mana around the dying vessel to hold it together just a little longer. Despite the pain, a content grin tugged at his lips. He hadn't known these people for long, and his efforts hadn't permanently solved their problems, but even this small act of kindness brought him a sense of satisfaction.
Keresh Dimlat.
"Kara's dim lot," they chanted over and over, their joy surpassing even his own. Waving them farewell, Percy took off, determined to accomplish one more task before his body gave out. He doubted it would make much difference, but he wanted to help the locals one last time before returning home. Retracing his steps from 2 weeks prior, he flew along the river. Before long, his destination came into view, the giant vent spewing brown gas into the air. Guessing this was the closest source of pollution to the village, Percy's plan was to filter as much of the substance as possible before his host expired. As he approached the colossal geyser, he noticed more of his kin this time, including a few larger ones with yellow cores. However, none had the distinctive gray fur of his host, indicating that the creature he was inhabiting was likely an elder, even among others of the same grade. "Hopefully we're close to a promotion too." Drawing nearer, Percy's vision was soon obscured by the dense cloud of gas, but he managed to orient himself toward the hole by tasting the concentration of the toxic substance around him. By now, he had to rely on mana sense to locate the other furballs, the population of which grew denser the closer he came to the source of the gas. At least that was the case at first. Past a certain point, the strawberry flavor in the air grew overwhelming, almost reminiscent of the syrupy sludge he'd extracted from the villagers' cores. As he pressed on, the number of orange-cored beasts began to dwindle. Here, the fog was so thick it was beginning to hinder his movements, the current pushing him back. The sweetness in his mouth gave way to a spicy sensation as his core began to burn. Wow! I guess even our species have their limits. Not that he cared much about his health. He only had minutes left anyway. Unlike his yellow-cored kin, who were unwilling to venture further, Percy pressed onward, diving deeper against the flow. Ignoring the pain in his sternum, he took deep breaths, trying to rid the world of as much of the toxic gas as he could manage as a final gift to the villagers. The remnants of his host's soul began to shatter, the knots of soul mana unraveling. Percy could already feel the ethereal cord linking him to his main body on Remir pulling him back. He resisted for as long as he could, until it seemed he was about to lose the battle, when something changed. His body began to burn more intensely than before, internal pressure threatening to tear him apart. Percy grinned, recognizing the sensation, one his familiar had experienced in the past. Looking inward, he quickly confirmed his suspicion. His body was saturated with dense yellow mana, though parts of it were dimmer than others. His organs were fighting a losing battle, struggling to purify the toxin into a state his core could handle. However, something began to shift as strands of green mana started to form in his sternum. As he had hoped, his host had lived just long enough to reach the boundary of his next promotion. The reckless baptism in the toxic fumes had proven to be precisely the catalyst required to push them over the edge. Soon, the green strands coiled together, consuming the yellow mana around them, as his core shifted colors, burning more fiercely than ever before. Keep it together, old cat. Usually, a core advancement was a joyous occasion. However, this was perhaps one of the few cases where it wouldn't do anyone much good. The creature's remaining lifespan would be tripled, but 3 times 0 was 0. It was still going to die within the next minute. As for Percy, his host's advancement only complicated matters, hastening the unraveling of the fragile bonds joining their souls. That said, he hoped to last long enough to harness this opportunity to do some real good. Just a few more seconds. He smiled wryly. Now that the furball had advanced, they could consume a tremendous quantity of the toxic gas. Strictly speaking, the vent was too large for a single creature to filter by itself, whether it was at green or even blue. However, there was one critical exception where a beast could consume far more than normal. At the moment of its advancement, back when Mickey had evolved to orange, Percy and the crow had spent all night scouring the Whistling Woods, feeding the bird anything they could find, so it could rebuild its body to suit its new grade. This time, the furball had advanced to green 2 grades higher, and its diet consisted entirely of the toxic brown gas. Just how much of it would it need to consume to complete its transformation? Well, Percy intended to find out. Fighting against his crumbling body, Remir's pull and the pressure from the vent. He opened his mouth, inhaling the gas as forcefully as he could. Normally, his lungs would have filled in an instant, but now his body hungrily absorbed every bit of material that entered, breaking down the toxins into nutrients necessary for growth. Soon, the clone transformed into a ravenous vortex, greedily sucking in the brown fog like a drain at the bottom of a tub. He could feel his body swelling at an alarming rate, doubling in size within half a minute as the remaining shards of the dying soul grew just as quickly as they crumbled. This pace wouldn't last long. His vessel was already nearing its new limits, but the massive intake of mist triggered another change. The pressure from the vent was no longer enough to push him back, his expanding body beginning to accelerate toward it. Having absorbed enough nutrients, the flow of gas began to slow, but Percy refused to let it. He forced his body to continue drawing in every last particle of poison it could, even as he hurtled dangerously toward the ground. He slammed into a stone wall with a deafening crash, feeling both bones and rock shatter as the impact knocked the air from his lungs and sent his body rebounding. More impacts followed, each collision wreaking havoc on his flesh as well as the surrounding environment. Percy heard more stones crashing down as sections of the vent's walls crumbled, but he didn't pay that any heed, focusing solely on maintaining his grip on the dying soul and inhaling more fumes with every ounce of willpower he had left. By now, every bone in the furball's body had turned into mush, as a bunch of boulders fell on top of him, pushing him down. Percy's lungs felt like they were on fire, the pungent substance overwhelming even his newly upgraded constitution. I hope that was enough, he thought, his consciousness finally slipping out of the dying vessel. Percy knew his actions didn't truly amount to much. The furballs he had placed inside the villagers' houses would leave sooner or later. The cores he had cleansed would eventually end up polluted again, and the poison he had consumed inside the vent would hardly make a dent. And even if he ended up helping out the people in that village, just how many more villages like that were scattered around this world? But he didn't regret trying. Everything he'd done would buy these people some precious time. With higher grades, a cleaner environment and healthier bodies, the ones with the pure affinity would be able to produce more cyan powder too, extending everyone's lives even more. They might still die, but the few years he had bought them mattered. They mattered just as much as when he'd killed Mixcoatl, or when he'd preserved his friend's soul to create his familiar. Percy wasn't strong enough yet to free the people of Huehue, or to cleanse all the poison in this world, but he would do what he could, to help as many as he could. Why? Because he felt like it. Mickey was his friend, and he'd grown fond of the natives here too. Wasn't that what magic ultimately was? the power to exert one's will on the world. I'll keep growing stronger, and one day, I'll have the power to make a lasting impact. Chapter 68, Alchemist. Percy stirred the concoction at a modest, yet steady pace. A few bubbles began to form, but not too many. Instead of panicking, he continued going as he had, only carefully adjusting the temperature slightly with his free hand. A few seconds later, the foam died down, the mixture settling into a transparent gel at the bottom of the cauldron. Carefully pouring the substance onto a membrane over a vial's mouth, he watched it distilled into a clear liquid. The droplets made crisp sounds, splashing inside the sapphire bottle one after another. 65 drops. Congratulations, Percy. That's over 16%. You've improved again, Orin said. Letting out a breath he'd been holding, Percy also felt a sense of triumph rising over his achievement. It had already been 2 weeks since his clone returned, and he'd been able to brew some elixir every day since. His yield had started off at a modest 15%, but it was already slightly higher than that. There was still some way to go before he could be considered a fully fledged alchemist, but at least the losses were small enough he could stomach them on his own now. A good thing too, as today was his final session sponsored by his mentor. "Thank you, sir. I owe everything to your kindness," he said. "How many times do I need to tell you to just call me Orin? And no, given how hard you've been working, I'm sure you would have reached this point sooner or later. I only helped you get started." Percy chuckled. "That's still massive. It would have taken me years to gather enough points by myself." Orin patted his shoulder before speaking. "In any case, I'm sure you can reach 25% if you keep at it for a few more months. Just promise me you won't pull off another reckless stunt." The young man gazed down at his feet, unable to look the alchemist in the eye. "Percy, promise me." Orin had bought his lie about getting injured by the Starry soldiers. That much was unavoidable, as the alternative was confessing to murder. However, what exacerbated Percy's guilt was that he planned to start hunting the yellow bugs for real. Now that he'd settled his previous concerns, he intended to put his new strength to work. "The most I can promise is to be more careful in the future," he replied after a few seconds. Orin didn't say anything, instead just patting his shoulder again. The two bid each other farewell as Percy left his mentor's place for the night. Moving forward, he was still allowed to use the old alchemist's lab, but he wouldn't be provided with any more free materials or supervision. Thinking back to his gains over the past month, he couldn't help but grin. During his clone's absence, he'd lost a lot of time from hunting, which meant he'd collected much less elixir the normal way. However, adding in the amount he'd looted from his unfortunate victim, as well as the ones he'd brewed himself, he still had over 40 vials left. Each brewing session started with 400 drops of nectar and currently took him around an hour from beginning to the end. Over the last 2 weeks, he'd reliably earned over 60 drops per session, for 4 sessions per day, meaning that Orin had allowed him to keep over a month's worth of elixir. However, his income would take a massive drop now that he had to pay for his own materials. After all, he was still brewing at a loss. He sure hoped his new targets would be profitable enough to cover the difference. Percy was breathing heavily as he reached the Starry worker. At least, dispatching it wasn't that hard. It only took a single swipe of his sickle. He owed his exhaustion to something else. Over the past few days, the young man had practiced activating both types of circulation at the same time and keeping them going for longer. At first, it had been somewhat tricky to recall how he'd managed to get his soul mana flowing that night. The circumstances at the time had been rather unique. Still, he was able to replicate his success after some trial and error. In fact, by now he could even do it without injuring his soul too much in the process. Unlike the cyan lines of pure mana forming static patterns on his skin, their silver counterparts constantly moved around in a chaotic vortex, resembling a maelstrom centered around his sternum. In any case, the new version of the art further enhanced his physical capabilities, letting him run even faster atop the giant mushrooms. That alone would have increased the number of glands he harvested, but he figured he'd get the most benefit by taking down the stronger variants. Sadly, the starry soldiers were located on the other side of the spire, so he'd have to spend a few hours running back and forth every day. At least, he and Mickey could minimize the wasted time by killing the orange variants en route to their cousins. I should start learning the crystallization technique too, Percy groaned. Killing the workers wasn't very difficult, so there was no better time to practice new spells than while traveling. The only issue was this particular technique required him to compress his mana over longer sessions. The frequent interruptions every time he had to kill a bug would be annoying. Still, even if it wasn't very efficient, he could work on it over time. Overall, Percy doubted he'd have enough nectar for over 2 hours of alchemy per day, which meant he would have about 16 hours to hunt on the second level. Of those, 1 was needed for the round trip from the settlement, while 6 more would be spent traveling to and from the location Nesha had told him about. He estimated he and Mickey could get around 12 workers in that time. That left him about 9 hours to hunt the yellow cord bugs, and he'd need to kill at least 7 of those per day to make as much nectar as he normally would. And I should try teaching Mickey circulation too. The crow still couldn't speak, but Percy guessed it was likely because it didn't need to. The bird was already more intelligent than a human child by now, not something a 2-year-old beast should be capable of. Even more importantly, due to beasts constantly fighting with their bodies, Mickey didn't need any physical training. He only needed to clear his remaining pathways, to temper them and then find the correct pattern for the mana to flow in. Given how smart he was and with Percy guiding him, he should be able to get it down within a few months. In fact, he harbored some hope the process would jog his friend's memories, making him learn faster, or helping him remember who he was. If all else fails, it's still worth it for the power-up. So once again, Percy had ended up with quite a few projects to work on in parallel. The increased profits from his lucrative prey would hopefully offset the losses from his subpar brewing, allowing him to continue funding one of his cores. He'd keep at it until he surpassed a 25% yield, at which point he'd switch to full-time alchemy. That should eventually get him enough points to cover for both of his cores. In the meantime, he'd keep feeding his familiar wasps, working on both Mickey's advancement and his own recovery, so that he could resume sending out clones once a month. The bird would also focus on learning circulation, which would allow it to hunt the workers on its own when mastered. That would let them split up, focusing on different tasks. At the same time, Percy would work on crystallization, eventually incorporating the cyan powder into his alchemy. He still wasn't sure what the exact result would be, but he had a hunch he could use it to improve the elixirs in some way. No time to waste. There are only 4.5 years left until the lotus blooms. Percy understood he still had a long way to go until he was strong enough to have a real voice in his family. Well, if he wanted to accomplish that without spilling his secrets or hugging Baldy's thighs, at least. Caw, caw. Mickey suddenly pecked his shoulder, breaking him out of his thoughts. You're right. I'm thinking too far into the future. For now, let's focus on what's right in front of us. They were there. They had finally reached the location of the starry soldiers. Percy grinned. He was about to have his first proper fight against a yellow cord beast. And with his own body at that. Chapter 69, Starry Soldiers. As soon as Percy overcame the shock of seeing a wasp as large as he was, he thought he'd have an easy time slaying the overgrown bug. Its slick black carapace still glittered with colors like its smaller cousins, but the soldier was large enough that its camouflage was essentially useless. After all, the motes of light slowly falling from the mushrooms above couldn't possibly conceal the man-sized creature, nor could they obscure the dense yellow shape thrumming within Percy's mana sense. So, with nowhere to hide and with such a bulky frame, how hard could it be to hit it with his sickle? Well, near impossible it turned out. I really need to stop jinxing everything. The soldier's stinger was about the shape and length of a rapier, delivering a barrage of lunges, trying to turn his head into a kebab. Strictly speaking, Percy didn't have much difficulty dodging the blows. They were more forgiving than the mage's stone javelins, especially with the bug's soul betraying its intentions ahead of time. Still, it was landing his own attacks that proved challenging. Unlike his human opponent who had stood in place like a sitting duck, Percy couldn't pin the wasp down. Despite its larger frame, the soldier was even more agile than the orange variants. Hitting it from a distance was a tall order. Then, there was the strategy Percy had used against the workers at the beginning. Back when he was weaker, he'd resorted to well-timed counterattacks to dispatch the bugs. Sadly, that wasn't applicable right now. His only means of defending himself had grown obsolete once more. And there wasn't much he could do about that. There's no way to block a yellow beast's attacks with pure mana from a red core. Until it advanced to orange, he'd have to retire his second core entirely. Its only use at the moment was the passive boost to his physique. Although he did have another advantage. Sidestepping a stab, Percy tried to bisect the wasp's soul with his left. It moved horizontally to dodge, but that gave him a chance to throw the second parting gift held by his right. Thanks to circulation, he could summon and maintain two of the weapons now. That said, the wasp flew up to avoid the second attack. Next, it only stared at him for a moment before diving back to unleash another rain of lunges, trying to take advantage of his missing weapon. Not that he had much trouble evading them, but a similar scene repeated once he finished replacing his second sickle. Half an hour later, the two were still at an impasse. The bug attacked whenever Percy was one weapon down, putting him on the back foot until he recovered. Whenever he did, it was his turn to go on the offense, but the soldier was just as good at evading. If necessary, Percy could keep circulation up with both cores for a couple more hours. Still, how do I create an opening? Having Mickey distract the creature was out of the question. Percy had already asked his familiar to remain at a safe distance, and he had no intention of letting him anywhere close to the monster. As Percy was evaluating his options, the soldier suddenly did something different. It flew a few meters above his head, before pointing its stinger down. Oh, damn! A purple blob emerged from the stinger's point, soon expanding to a blanket shrouding his view. Leaping to the side, Percy barely managed to roll out of the way as the sludge rained on the mushroom. SSSS. The surface of the giant fungus sizzled as a wall of brown gas rose to the sky. The small amount that reached Percy's nose burned his nostrils, even coating the back of his throat with an acrid aftertaste. However, that was just the start, as the wasp fired two more liquid projectiles. This time, it was harder evading them, some of the acid landing on his leg. SSSS. Ag. Percy hadn't expected to experience this again so soon. Luckily, it didn't corrode much deeper than his skin. The substance had spread rather thin during its flight. Otherwise, he wouldn't be surprised seeing his entire limb melted into a puddle, bones and everything. Not that it made his situation much less precarious. He barely got the chance to roll out of the way of the stinger, as it stabbed just inches from his face. Lodged into the mushroom, the wasp appeared stuck, but it still tried to crush his throat with its limbs, forcing him to keep crawling away. Only when he was a couple meters from the bug did he get the chance to stand up, before dashing towards the soldier, taking advantage of its immobility to finally kill it. That was a close one. Percy had thought his latest improvements would make this a walk in the park, but he couldn't have been more wrong. The acid rain attack was something he'd never seen the orange variants do. It could have easily spelled his doom if the bug wasn't limited to 3 consecutive shots. In fact, if the soldier hadn't stupidly trapped itself, the fight might have not even ended. You live, you learn. He shrugged. At least, this did give him an idea as to how he could use his pure mana against these creatures. Although it wasn't strong enough to block their blows or pierce their carapace, maybe he could protect himself from the acid rain with it. Mickey, come eat the core. The familiar didn't need to be told twice. Tearing into the hard exoskeleton took the bird a bit longer than usual, but it still managed to claw a hole soon enough. It first dug the gland out of the torso, throwing it to Percy with its talon. Then it dove back into the bug's sternum, looking for the tasty snack. Percy grabbed the gland. Ignoring his feasting friend, he took a vial out of his pouch. Next, he sliced it open with a knife before squeezing the nectar into the gemstone. 45. He counted with glee. He'd already known how much nectar the soldiers had on them, of course. Still, actually seeing half the vial filled with amber fluid after a single kill was truly satisfying. And to think the commanders on the top level have over 400 drops on them. That's enough for a dose of the elixir. Not that anybody hunted there, of course. Most guild members were already alchemists by the time they reached green, let alone blue. By then, they could earn a lot more points brewing than hunting. Oh well, I'll get there too. Soon. Here it comes again. The wasp fired a blob of acid like the last one. This time Percy was prepared. Through the passive soul vision granted by his circulation, he dodged the spray before it was even unleashed. He could have easily evaded the next 2 shots too, but he intentionally remained within the splash zone to test something out. Pure mana gushed out of his pores as he swiped his arm, brushing the droplets aside with a wave of cyan. The purple liquid rapidly dissolved the flimsy defense, some of it making it to Percy's skin. Still, most of it had been blocked. Success? Kinda. He made a weird expression halfway between a grin and a wince. He'd rather dodge the attacks entirely than rely on this, but it was nice knowing he had one last layer of protection. Next, the soldier dove down in an attempt to poke his eye out. Apparently, this one wasn't dumb enough to get itself trapped like the last bug. Dodging, Percy tried to land a melee blow, hitting nothing but empty air. Not getting discouraged, he quickly threw a handful of silver knives towards the creature. While he'd kept one of the parting gifts in the shape of a sickle, he'd decided to branch out by reverting the second one to a bunch of projectiles. 2 of them missed, but the last one grazed its side. The silver silhouette shook, the wasp's movements growing erratic. Finishing the injured creature only took a couple more minutes.
Ok.
Progress. At least Percy didn't come close to dying this time. Also, incorporating some level of variation in his arsenal looked promising. Still, he estimated he wouldn't kill more than 6 soldiers today. Surpassing his previous spoils would take a few more weeks. But he wasn't too disappointed. It's going to be worth it in the long term. His gains had been modest when he began hunting the workers too, yet they'd quickly eclipsed what was possible on the first level. Percy couldn't help but rub his hands in anticipation. After a year in the guild, his original goal was finally within reach. I'm going to have enough elixir for both of my cores soon. Chapter 70, Second Year in the Guild. More time passed as Percy worked hard on all fronts, improving both his hunting efficiency and his brewing yield. A month after his first fight against a starry soldier, he could already reliably kill around 10 of them per day. The difference was rather modest, but he welcomed the opportunity to hone his combat skills once more. Before, his efficiency had plateaued as he could already slay the workers near instantly, and his profits had been capped by his traveling speed. Now, he finally had the chance to work on both his stamina, extending circulation to last all day, and the potency of his magic, learning how to better slaughter the bugs. He also grew better at alchemy, raising his yield to 18%. Between earning 630 drops of nectar per trip and converting most of that into elixir, he could finally fully support one of his cores while still getting a lot of brewing practice. But he didn't stop there. 5 months later, or about half a year since the end of his funding, to Percy was able to hunt 14 soldiers per trip, while his yield had increased to a whopping 23%. He estimated he could have crossed the 25% threshold if he had continued spending 4 hours on alchemy per day, but sadly he only had enough nectar for about 2. Still, he was on the verge of supporting both of his cores when another interesting development occurred. Mickey finally mastered circulation. As Percy had come to learn through the numerous beasts his clones had possessed, a beast affinity was very uniquely suited for the technique. In fact, that was an understatement. Apparently, blood was the best medium for beast mana to flow in, making one's blood vessels synonymous with their channels. Even more importantly, since beasts didn't use conventional spells, they didn't fall into the trap of only clearing the channels branching out from their cores to their extremities. Instead, they passively cleared and tempered all their pathways, their mana constantly flowing through their whole body, always empowering it. Percy had been shocked by that discovery, realizing beasts already used circulation, albeit a weaker version of it. It had essentially been the truth behind their strength all along. It didn't take a genius to find the correct pattern for the mana to flow in either. It was identical to one's circulatory system. However, that didn't mean Mickey couldn't learn to use the full scope of the technique. It only meant circulation for a beast was equivalent to supercharging their blood flow, a bit like a steroid, drawing even more strength out of their bodies than usual. Beasts also couldn't exactly replenish their mana by breathing like mages did, because ambient mana didn't contain the beast affinity. They could still slowly draw some mana of other affinities from the air, converting it to beast mana, but it was much less efficient than it was for Percy. In Mickey's case, circulation drew its power from the crow's flesh and blood. It broke down the body, converting matter to strength. At first, Percy had worried this would have an adverse effect on his familiar. After a few tests, however, he concluded it wouldn't. Perhaps it might be an issue for a beast living in an environment where food was scarce. For Mickey, who had more wasp meat than he knew what to do with, it wouldn't be a problem. It only meant he had to eat some more of his prey's bodies per day, and he'd wake up fresh the following morning. The only reason it had even taken the bird so long to master the technique was due to its reluctance. It had needed a lot of convincing from Percy before it was willing to endure the strain of the spell. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but the familiar quickly came around after enjoying the benefits of the technique. And naturally, that was a game-changer for them. Mickey had already been able to easily find the workers before. He just hadn't been great at killing them. However, his efficiency soared after his upgrade. The crow could now hunt the orange variants way faster by itself, as Percy only slowed the bird down. On his first day roaming the second level alone, Mickey took down over 40 wasps, brutally shattering their previous record. At that point they split up, with Mickey spending all day hunting the workers by himself, while Percy was free to focus on crystallization as he traveled to the soldiers. They also gathered over 1,200 contribution points per day, not only giving Percy enough for both cores, but even letting him save some. For months later, their hunting trips hadn't improved much, with Mickey capping at around 43 kills per day, and Percy unable to get past 15. Still, his brewing yield finally reached 26%, making him a fully fledged alchemist. According to Oren, he could even take a test if he wanted, to be officially acknowledged by the guild. It would raise his status if he left one day. It still wouldn't be on par with a Yellowborn, but he'd receive better treatment than Orangeborns who had never dabbled in alchemy. It wasn't a huge deal, and Percy didn't see a reason to bother just yet, but perhaps he could consider it when it was time to leave. More importantly, he could now brew elixirs at a profit, and he even had a lot stashed in his house. He had enough to last as a buffer for 2 months once he stopped hunting. It was finally time to make the transition to full-time alchemy. At first, it would be less profitable than his current hunting trips, but that would be temporary. By brewing 18 hours per day, he would improve rapidly, meaning he'd continue increasing his yield several times faster. And sure enough, another 2 months later, or 1 year after Oren's funding stopped, Percy reached a 30% yield. That was when the improvements truly slowed down, but it was enough. Each brewing session only took him about 40 minutes now, and with such a yield it meant he could now earn 2,160 points per day. That was without even including the 645 points Mickey got. Finally, his 2 original goals in coming to the guild had already been met. He could now fund both of his cores, and Mickey had a perfect environment to keep hunting orange beasts to his heart's content. Even better, Percy was making over 3 times as much money as he needed, so in theory he could fall back and relax for a while. He chuckled. As if Percy might have met his initial targets, but there were still many projects he had to worry about. He had continued sending his clones out about once a month, although they'd all returned empty-handed. A couple of them had ended up possessing sentient creatures again, but neither of them had access to anything that couldn't be found on Remir. Not that it was a bad thing, as he had yet to fully process his gains from the primitive village. By now, he could compress the Scion constructs by about 40%. It was still a little short of what he needed, and his improvements had slowed down as he hadn't had much time outside alchemy to invest in the technique over the past couple of months. Still, now that he was free, he decided to only brew as much elixir as he needed for the next few weeks, spending the rest of his time on crystallization. He had a hunch it would let him take an important step forward once mastered. His other long-term projects included the creation of a starry wasp familiar and repairing Mickey's second core. The former still stumped him, as there were way too many impossible problems he had to overcome. Having two ethereal chords at once was already difficult, so he couldn't even consider creating another familiar without losing the ability to send out clones. Not to mention the issue with stealing a wasp egg from the depths of the fungal spire under the noses of blue and violet beasts. As for repairing Mickey's core, that was more doable. The 1 million contribution points he needed were a lot, but given his current income, they were no longer impossible to amass. Even without any further improvements, he'd get there in less than 2 years if he saved up all his excess money. Though he still hoped his gamble with crystallization would pay off beforehand. Let's do it then. I need to compress the damn crystal by the end of the month. Chapter 71, Crystallization. A vein throbbed on Percy's forehead, his skin already a deep crimson color. His eyes were shut, to shield them from the annoying streams of sweat pouring down his face. His body shook, his muscles having already been locked in their current position for over an hour. A palm was placed on top of the other, both squeezing hard on a glowing sphere with all their strength. 2 sets of bright lines pulsed underneath his flesh. The cyan ones were static, drawing orderly curves on his body, while the silver ones constantly shuffled, outlining a violent maelstrom swirling around his sternum. Just a little more. Percy gritted his teeth. He couldn't estimate how close he was exactly, but he felt he'd been on the verge of compressing the pure mana into a crystal for the past few days. Today, he'd resolved himself to doing whatever it took to finally cross the threshold. And just like that, the young man felt something snap in place, as the cyan marble stopped fighting back a few minutes later. But Percy wasn't in a hurry to quit, unwilling to risk wasting his efforts. Luckily, he received some additional confirmation of his success not long after. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Crystallization? Crude. Wow! It's been a long time since my status registered something new. Finally free to deactivate circulation, Percy let go of the orb, plopping back on the cold stone weakly. His chest heaved up and down, as he watched the crystal roll away on his room's floor. Perhaps it would have been more comfortable to do this on his bed, but he didn't want to get his mattress all sweaty. In any case, he was done. His lips curled upwards as the last motes of mana seeped out of his pores. It had taken him over a year, but the new spell was finally ready. Opening his status, he spent the next couple of minutes gawking at it in silent appreciation. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana Core 1. Orange. Soul. Mana Core 2. Red. Pure. Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Spells. Parting Gift, crude. Secret Art. Familiar, crude. Quarterstaff, crude. Glove, crude. Crystallization, crude.
Circulation refined.
Grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. Grants a second mana core. 6 spells. Percy was pretty sure nobody else on Remir had this many at his age. If it hadn't been for the various opportunities granted by his bloodline, he knew he would have only mastered a single one by now. The status never bothered registering variants of the same spell if they weren't sufficiently different from one another. This was why there was only a single mention of circulation. Also, why his parting gift was only listed once, despite all the slight permutations he could cast. In fact, the 2 most similar spells listed separately were his quarterstaff and his glove. Strictly speaking, both were just regular constructs of pure mana, although their purpose was very different to one another, as were the principles of their design. He still wasn't sure what the status was for. He guessed it was meant to encourage mages to branch out, developing distinct lines of magic. As for the spell's classification, it was probably there to push people to delve deeper into each one. So, whoever created it wants us to develop multiple powerful spells. But what for? In the end, he shrugged. This wasn't something he could figure out right now, nor did it matter too much to him at the moment. Pushing himself up, He walked to the marble before grabbing it. It was warm to the touch, but he guessed that was just an artifact of his lingering body heat from holding it for so long. It was a little sticky too, drenched in sweat, prompting him to wipe it on his robes a few times. Only then did he lift it in front of his eyes, examining it more closely. It was about the size of a cherry, its smooth surface shimmering with a pale cyan light. Percy was tempted to keep the first one as a memento, but his anticipation won out in the end. He'd already looked forward to testing its effects for so long. Making his way to the kitchen table, he sifted through his alchemy equipment for a pestle and mortar. Tossing the marble inside, he gave it one final glance before sealing its fate. Without his willpower and his hands pressing on the sphere uniformly, it shattered rather easily, the brittle material quickly giving way under the weight of the bronze tool. Less than a minute later, Percy was looking at a small pile of powder, reminding him of his short time in the primitive village. I wonder how those people are doing. Had their cores succumbed to the poison once more? They must have. The brown fog was both abundant and fast-acting. Shaking the distracting thoughts out of his mind, Percy walked to the tap, opening it slightly to let a few drops of water into the pestle. Recalling Hemirakura's actions, he mixed the contents with his fingers, before gulping down the cyan paste. Next, he pulled some soul mana from his sternum, letting it swirl inside his stomach for a couple minutes, before moving it back. Originally, his core still burned a little. It had only been a few hours since he consumed today's elixirs. However, as soon as he pushed the enriched mana inside it, the ethereal organ itched, the discomfort easing slightly. Holy shit! It works! Percy hadn't been certain it would, as his circumstances were somewhat different from the natives of that world. Still, he had persisted in his madness, recognizing the underlying principles behind the two situations were similar. The villagers Percy had encountered had relied on the cyan paste to mend their cores, letting them survive the poison longer, despite lacking the means of purging it entirely. Strictly speaking, the damage caused by the brown mist wasn't that different from what the elixirs did. Of course, the effect of the elixirs was more surgical, designed to target the impurities. Still, the process always left the organ injured, forcing people to wait 24 hours for it to recover after each dose. But if the powder could speed things up, I can accelerate my advancement. The question was how much more frequently he could drink the elixirs. I'm gonna have to test a couple things. A few days later, Percy already had some answers. The cyan paste seemed to merely provide the nutrients his core needed. A single marble was more than enough for his recovery, so consuming more than one didn't do anything. In other words, he couldn't spam the process to mend the core instantly. No matter what, he was limited to one dose of powder after each dose of elixir. As for the exact recovery period, it seemed to fluctuate depending on when he used the paste. The sooner he did, the fresher the wounds in his core were, making the powder more effective. When he consumed the paste right after the elixir, his core recovered twice as fast as normal. I can advance both my cores in half the time. His heart skipped a beat. Of course, it would also be twice as expensive. Not just that, but he'd also need about 6 hours to condense enough crystals. That would only leave him about 12 hours to spend on brewing. With his income dropping sharply and his costs doubling, he estimated he would barely keep up with his needs. Suddenly, he felt a little envious of the old lady. She only needed about an hour for each marble. Percy groaned. Granted, her core had been at orange, giving her an edge when it came to controlling pure mana. She was a lot more experienced than him too. Still, he had his own advantages, so he figured he'd catch up soon enough. Actually, this is all temporary anyway. Calculating the time he'd already spent on his second core, Percy was over 2/3 into his next promotion. If he began consuming 4 elixirs per day, he would get there in under a year. At that point, condensing the crystals would become much easier too. And there was another thing that gave him pause. There should be a way to drink the elixirs and the paste at the same time. Since the effects of the powder improved depending on how soon it was used, Percy had naturally tried consuming both substances simultaneously. The elixir and the paste had mixed in his stomach without issue, But the moment he added his own mana, it all reacted violently, eliminating the potency of both materials before he even had the chance to draw them back to his core. That said, Percy wasn't too discouraged. He already had an idea as to how he could fix this. He'd just need some time to work on it. If he succeeded, he could speed up his advancement even further. I guess I can delegate all my excess income into modifying the recipe over the next few months. Chapter 72, Unexpected Visitor. Drip, drip, drip. Tossing the empty gland aside, Percy picked the next one, carving a small incision into the soft tissue before squeezing it over the vial. A few seconds later, he threw another one to the pile, which contained hundreds by now, before moving on. Gone were the days when he and Mickey spent all their time hunting together on the spire. Over the past several months, Percy had focused on his alchemical endeavors, leaving the crow alone to tend to its own needs. Nowadays, they only met up once a week, for Percy to retrieve the glands stashed by his familiar, handing him rejuvenation potions in return. Caw, caw. There you are, running a little late today. The young man grinned. He waved at the crow flying rapidly towards him, a small pouch held in its beak. Percy returned to the task at hand, emptying the last couple of glands by the time Mickey reached him. The bird landed on the dirt right next to him, as the amber lines on its plumage faded. Next, Mickey gently placed the linen bag on the ground. Handing a different pouch to the crow, Percy watched his familiar fly excitedly to a nearby tree, the gem vials making clinking sounds as they tumbled inside the cloth. Having learned from his mistakes, Percy now carried even the cheaper potions in the expensive vials, to prevent them from breaking. Mickey dropped his new supplies in an oversized nest, as the young man opened the pouch the familiar had brought, picking another gland from the fresh batch. Keep up the good work, buddy. I'll get you the mind mana as soon as I can. Caw. If Percy dropped everything else and merely focused on making as much money as possible, he could amass enough enlightenment potions in under 2 years. However, not only would that slow down his own progress, but he also strongly suspected it wouldn't even be the quickest way. He had a hunch he could make a lot more money once he figured out how to profit from the cyan paste. Of course, there were a few obstacles to overcome. First, he couldn't sell it in its raw form, as that would risk people figuring out how to reproduce it. After all, the only thing one needed was a pure affinity, which was extremely common on Remir. In fact, Percy was surprised nobody had discovered the usefulness of the powder before. His guess was that it took too much effort for people under blue to crystallize their mana. They were unlikely to stumble upon the spell by mistake. As for those above, they were already too fixated on their ways by the time they reached blue, so even if they accidentally condensed their mana, they wouldn't necessarily realize the implications. The natives in that world had probably tried everything they could to alleviate their poisoning, stumbling upon this secret out of sheer desperation. Or luck. But people weren't dumb. If Percy sold the paste directly, it wouldn't take them long to figure it out. Consequently, he'd have to incorporate it inside the elixirs before profiting off it. The next issue was finding a suitable location for his experiments. He couldn't work on the new recipe in the public labs, so he'd have to come clean to Orin. Percy greatly respected his old mentor, but he also had no idea how the alchemist would react to such a revolutionary discovery. Finally, even if everything went well, he'd still have to find a proper avenue to sell the product safely and secretly. After all, he wouldn't be able to create too much of the improved elixir by himself. If knowledge of it leaked and he couldn't meet the demand, the Divine Order would skin him alive for the recipe. Oh well, if I mess things up, I'll just publicize it and wash my hands of the mess. It wouldn't be ideal, as he'd be giving up on his advantage, but it would be better than losing his life. Unlike his other secrets, he could claim he had just stumbled upon crystallization by accident. It wasn't nearly as exotic as a second core or circulation, so he wouldn't have to spill the beans on his bloodline. It's such a pain, keeping so many secrets, he grimaced. At least nobody came to me asking about the missing guy. I suppose it's safe to assume I got away with it by now. Bidding his familiar farewell, Percy returned to the settlement. On the way to Freddy's, he tossed a quick glance at the spot where Nesh's stand used to be. It had already changed hands multiple times, the current owner being a yellow core with a life affinity, offering cheap healing services. As for Nesha, she had rented a stone building a long time ago, opening a proper gambling den. It was quite impressive too. Based on what Percy had heard, the guild charged a lot more when leasing buildings for commercial reasons than they did for accommodation. Not that there was a shortage or anything, but they did it on purpose to discourage small business owners from renting buildings they didn't really need. In any case, it only spoke to how much money the girl was making. Percy was confident she was even wealthier than him, despite his recent success. Good for her, he shrugged. At least the new owner of the stand had spent a lot more effort on the sign. Oh, hi Percy. Freddie greeted him with a smile, which quickly morphed into a mischievous grin. I thought it was your time of the month again. Percy snorted. His friend had been teasing him about this for a while now. In hindsight, he should have realized altering his schedule for a few days per month would lead to misunderstandings. Not that he could do much about it. This was simply the most convenient timing to send out his clones, taking into account the average length of his trips and the impact they had on his main body. In the end, he'd given up, simply playing into the joke. No, my period is next week, he shot back. They stared at each other silently for a couple of seconds. Freddie was the first to burst into laughter, Percy joining him a moment later. There you go, man. The plump guy handed him the steaming snack, as the young man paid him a brown chip, worth a tenth of a contribution point. Percy held the honey roll with both hands as if it was the most precious treasure, biting a huge chunk out of it. He closed his eyes to savor it too, as the crispy dough blended with the warm honey in his mouth. If I hadn't watched you eat them every night for the past 2 years, I'd have thought it was your first one, Freddie said. Haven't you grown sick of them yet? Never, Percy protested in shock a few seconds later, but only after swallowing. The two chatted for a while longer. It was mostly Freddie gossiping, really, as Percy didn't have too much to talk about, since he tended to spend most of his days holed up in a lab. At the end, the young man waved his friend goodbye, but not before buying a second honey roll to take home. Part of it was to make a statement, while the rest was just because the things were that damn good. It was late by the time he reached his place. Shockingly, he saw a woman in green standing outside. The hell? Percy paled. He never got visitors, so his mind instantly went to the worst-case scenario. Don't tell me I've jinxed myself again. Part of him wanted to run, but it would only make things worse. Maybe she was here for something else. Hello? How may I help you? He asked, trying to sound calm. It was only now the woman seemed to notice him. Are you Percival Avalon? She asked, prompting him to swallow hard. Geez, calm down, Percy. Even if they learned about the missing guy, how would they link it to you after a year? In the end, he just nodded silently. The woman didn't say anything either, approaching him instead. She placed her hand in her pocket, searching for something. Right when Percy expected her to pull out a pair of handcuffs, she took out an envelope instead, handing it to him. It's a letter from your house, she said. Then she left without even waiting for the reply, as Percy watched her walk down his porch, his mouth agape. Seriously? Have you people never heard of mailboxes? You almost gave me a heart attack. It wasn't until a few minutes later that he had calmed down enough to look at the sender's name. Elaine Avalon. Chapter 73, House Tantalus. Entering his room, Percy gobbled up his honey roll swiftly, before taking a quick shower. Only after he was done with today's chores did he allow himself to sink into his bed, finally taking the letter out of its envelope. Talk about going all out. He chuckled. The penmanship was immaculate, and the light indigo paper smelled of lavender. His cousin had clearly poured a lot of effort into this. Dear Percy, I hope this letter finds you well. No, really. You left without even saying goodbye and haven't bothered writing in over 2 years. To the point we aren't even sure you made it to the guild safely. So, if you are reading this, thank Phoebe. But also, please know you are a massive jerk. Ouch. Elaine's scathing words stung, but Percy couldn't exactly argue against them. At the very least, he should have let her and Baldy know he was all right. Well, it's not like you wrote me either. Still, he decided to contact them more frequently from now on, before diving back to the letter. Now that we got that out of the way, I wanted to bring you up to date on our house's news. One of my missions ended really badly right around the time you left. Our cousin, Elaine, passed away. But I don't want you to worry about me. Things were a little rough for a while, but I'm doing much better now. I managed to upgrade my whip spell, and I recently perfected those dance moves you showed me too. Oh, and my mother is expecting. I'm going to be a sister in a few months. Percy nodded. He didn't really know Elaine that well, but he could tell his death still weighed heavily on Elaine's conscience. I should ask Baldy about the details the next time we meet. Either way, the rest of his cousin's news were much more positive. The dance moves she mentioned were obviously code for circulation. Percy wasn't sure how secure these letters were, but Elaine clearly wasn't willing to take any chances, which suited him just fine. That meant she had at least 2 refined spells listed in her status now. That ought to have made her a force to be reckoned with. Even without a bloodline, he doubted any noble their age would be a match for her. However, the letter wasn't over yet. Broadly speaking, things have been peaceful around here, although House Tantalus is beginning to stir up trouble again. They've already messed with a few of our people out on missions. Thankfully, they haven't done anything too drastic yet, but Grandpa thinks it's only a matter of time before they escalate. House Tantalus. Percy gritted his teeth. Those were the same people who'd attacked them when he was young, the ones who'd killed his parents. He didn't know what exactly the deal was between the 2 houses. It seemed to be a complicated mix of an old grudge, territorial disputes, and also some drama around their bloodline. But yeah, it didn't take a genius to figure out why Elaine had decided to contact him all of a sudden. So, I just wanted to warn you against traveling by yourself anytime soon. Definitely not to our house, but also in general. Ever since that god's announcement, all the noble families have gone crazy. Commoners too, actually. From what I hear, a lot of people are turning into bandits, hoping to kidnap somebody important to trade for one of the petals. This was in line with Oren's speculations. Well, it's not like I was planning to leave soon. There should still be over 3 years left until the lotus blooms. Besides, I can get an escort back if I need it. Elaine's next words corroborated that. That's not to say you shouldn't visit. According to Grandpa, you'll be safe if you travel with the guild's envoys. Nobody in their right mind would attack them. Due to the widespread need for elixirs, most noble houses had frequent dealings with the alchemists. Percy knew his own family needed thousands of doses per month, so a group of blue cores was given the job of delivering them 3 times a year. No bandit group had the power to mess with such a force. In theory, a rival house could, but none of them were dumb enough to try. Attacking the guild's people was tantamount to declaring war on all of Remir. Sadly, the next delivery had been months away back when Mickey advanced, so Percy had chosen to take the risk rather than waiting. Returning to the letter, Percy quickly noted it contained some more coded messages. Finally, we'd like to know how you're doing. Have you been able to dive into alchemy yet? Grandpa has been feeling guilty we couldn't give you the elixirs you wanted back home. He says he'll figure out a way to convince the rest of the family if you still need them. Also, he said he'll take some time off his schedule to brew your favorite tea if you want. In any case, make sure to keep in touch this time. Lots of love. Elaine. My favorite tea, huh? Percy grinned. Naturally, he had nothing of the sort. Baldy was clearly talking about the petals. He should have realized Percy would want one, and he was subtly telling him he'd try to make it happen. Still, it won't be easy for him. If it was that simple, Percy wouldn't have needed to travel all the way to the Alchemists' Guild for elixirs, not to mention something as miraculous as the petals. But Archibald obviously understood this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so he didn't want his grandson to miss it. Percy felt a fuzzy sensation in his chest. Having people who genuinely cared for him was a novel feeling, though it did exacerbate his guilt over not contacting them sooner. That said, I'm not as helpless as I used to be. His relatives' intentions were good, but they had no idea how much he had progressed over the past 2 years. He wasn't powerful enough to travel around the world freely, but he could still handle the average bandit group in a direct confrontation. If he ran into someone like Rick and his goons, he was confident he could beat them without relying on his familiar or resorting to a sneak attack this time. Percy could brew his own elixirs too, although he had yet to find a way to do it away from the guild. The nectar wasn't exported outside the fungal spire, so he'd lose his main source of income once he left. Still, if he succeeded in creating a wasp familiar, he could fix that too. Even when it came to the petals, he already had something in mind. I can trade circulation for it. It wasn't perfect, but it would be easier than exchanging it for elixirs. While a petal was more valuable, it was also a single-use consumable. He just had to convince one of the 3 recipients to part with it. It was better than handing the spell to everyone in his house's management and getting them to keep giving him elixir forever. In the latter case, he'd also have to reveal his second core, and his secrets were more likely to leak the more people he told. Galahad will probably get one. The man had a lightning affinity, which could be elevated to acid with the petal. His status in the family was the highest too. Still, as much of a prick as he was, he'd probably recognize that circulation would help him more, especially if Percy managed to figure the final step of the technique. If not him, one of the other 2 will agree for sure. There was also the cyan powder. Getting another violet core sooner would be massive for his family. Though Percy would rather not spend the next 70 years of his life feeding his uncle the cyan paste twice a day. At least I have options now. He also had plenty of time to decide. Shrugging, he quickly searched through his cupboards for something to write with, eager to get back to his cousin. He did manage to find a quill and a half-empty bottle of ink. Remnants from the previous owner of the house, obviously, as he'd never bought any. Percy confirmed the ink was still usable, when he realized he didn't have anything to write on. I mean, I could write on the back of Elaine's letter. He smiled wryly before shooting the idea down. There was definitely enough space there, but it would be crass of him. Don't do it, Percy. Don't be a Nesha. Let's just buy some paper tomorrow. Chapter 74, Gabe. The state of his latest host shocked Percy. On one hand, he'd spent way too long searching for a body, so he had no choice but to compromise. This person's condition was much worse than he'd like. However, as broken as it was, this was still one of the strongest souls any of his clones had come across. Probably a sentient. Also, a higher grade than usual. Knowing that a good first impression was half the battle, he wasn't in a hurry to reach out. Instead, he took a moment deliberating how to best introduce himself, unwilling to spook an otherwise promising host, though he never got the chance. The stranger spoke first. Wow, sending ghosts now? You guys are getting really creative. This wasn't among the reactions Percy was expecting, but he didn't sense any hostility, which was a good sign. I'm not a ghost, just a soul clone, he explained. What's the difference? His host asked. Percy would have creased his brow if he had one. While he'd never thought of his clones like that, they were invisible, incorporeal, and could possess bodies. Functionally, they did fit with what he imagined a ghost to be. Okay, I can see why you'd call me that. Still, I should clarify that I wasn't sent by whoever you think sent me. Oh, really? The spirit sounded amused. Are you not here to uncover the magical secrets of this world? The response left Percy stumped. All right, you got me again. But how could you possibly know that? I've only been to a few places so far. Rather remote too. Do you often get visited by foreign souls? He asked.
Souls? No.
That's why I was surprised by your approach. But lots of people want a piece of our world. Sadly for them, infiltrating this place is impossible. Or well, it used to be, I suppose, his host explained. The spirit's words made Percy want to rub his hands. This was shaping into quite the treasure trove already. A powerful host he could communicate with, and a rich world coveted by all. But their body was deteriorating fast, and this person seemed suspicious of him. Look, I admit you got me figured out. I guess I am a ghost, and I am also here in search of knowledge to make myself stronger. However, I'm not some powerful god, nor is there any organization behind me. I'm just a random guy with an orange core, wandering blindly around the universe, picking up whatever crumbs I find," he said. "My point is, I couldn't really do too much damage to your world even if I wanted to. Which I don't," he hurriedly added. His host sent him something akin to a mental shrug. "I'm sorry. I may have inadvertently given you the impression I care. The truth is, I have no loyalty to this place. Even if you were sent by our enemies to hurt us, I wouldn't give a shit." Percy was surprised once more. He wasn't the most altruistic person either, but he wouldn't be so indifferent if an outsider tried to use him to take down Remier. Still, his host's callousness made him easy to work with. "All right, then perhaps we can strike a deal. I'll patch your soul up for a while, and you'll let me learn whatever I can in that time." A pang of laughter rang in their shared consciousness, but it sounded hollow. "That's a great start, but it seems to me you're getting the better end of the bargain." The spirit protested. "How so? I'll still be dead in a couple of days. Meanwhile, you get to return home, enjoying your gains for the rest of your life." Percy remained silent for a few seconds. It was true his offer was lopsided, but he couldn't help it. "Look, as I mentioned, you're not the first person I possess. Sadly, I can't fix you permanently. The most I can do is hold your broken soul together for a while. Then there's nothing in it for me. Or do I look like a charity?" They appeared to be at an impasse. "So, are we going to waste this? Can't you think of a way to make it work?" Percy asked again, unwilling to lose this chance. "Well, I know how to fix my body, at least. But it won't be easy. Plus, it's basically squandering an otherwise valuable opportunity. Originally, I was hoping to use it for something else. Do you think that's enough to save me?" Percy considered it for a few moments. Despite what his new host might believe, he wasn't exactly an expert on souls. Everything he knew were just bits and pieces he'd discovered by accident. Still, he took this seriously. Technically, he could lie to get what he wanted, but deceiving a dying person didn't sit well with him. "Honestly, I don't know," he ultimately said. "I've never managed to heal my host's bodies before, so I have no idea what that does to their soul. At a minimum, it should slow down its degradation, buying us more time. As for anything beyond that, I can only promise to do my best to help you." The spirit didn't reply right away, taking a few minutes to contemplate Percy's words. Eventually, he probably realized this was the best he was going to get. "Fair enough. Name's Gabriel, by the way. Friends call me Gabe, though. Or well, they would, if I had any." Percy felt the natural resistance of his host disappear, allowing him to move more freely in the damaged vessel. Seeing that their condition was critical, he stretched his soul wisp, touching as many fragments as he could without delay. Only then did he release some of the stashed mana, letting it flow to the cracks, gluing himself to Gabe. Having already sent out over 30 clones, Percy was a bit of a veteran by now. He'd grown somewhat proficient at patching his hosts up efficiently, meaning he didn't need to use all his mana right away. The rest, he kept as a trump card, in case Gabe needed a follow-up treatment. "Percy," he replied, finally able to tap into the body's senses. A bizarre sight greeted him. He found himself lying face up in a spacious room, its ceiling as high as its sides were long. It appeared to be a dark gray cube, over 50 meters wide, entirely made of a smooth metal. Bright runes covered all its surfaces, their combined glow more than sufficient to illuminate the place. They were smaller, denser, and far more intricate than anything he'd seen before. The symbols were joined together with all sorts of geometric shapes and curved lines. If this magical script could be likened to a detailed painting from a talented artist, then everything they had back on Remier, including the glyphs in the Alchemist's Guild, were nothing more than a toddler's scribbles. "Ah, shit!" Shifting a little made him wince, the pain breaking him out of his daze. It hurt all over, though this wasn't his first rodeo. Soon, he filtered out the unpleasant sensation, before gazing down at his body. "Geez, what are we? Some kind of man-shaped jellyfish?" While Gabe was vaguely humanoid, his flesh was transparent. Through their skin, Percy saw an assortment of strange organs decorating the interior of their torso. A pale sphere-like thing pulsed rhythmically like a heart in their chest. It was right behind the bright blue star burning in their sternum. Percy didn't know what affinity it was, but a quick activation of mana sense revealed the core was at green. As for the rest of the squirming organs, their colors varied from turquoise to deep purple, and Percy couldn't name any of them if his life depended on it. He also had 4 limbs, his favorite number to have, but they all ended in just 3 digits. Workable, I guess. More concerning was the lack of clothes, other than a pair of brown shorts, and the numerous cuts all over their body, all oozing out a clear, viscous liquid. Please tell me that isn't your blood. Seemingly oblivious to the novelty of his guest's situation, Gabe didn't even register his words, clearly impatient to get himself healed. Without even giving Percy a chance to read his new status, he spoke. Cube. Restart the Swarm Challenge. Green level. User ID 004527945512. Authorization granted. Restarting Swarm Challenge. Green level. The user has already cleared Wave 5. Do you wish to resume at Wave 6? Warning. Wave 6 contains elite enemies. A soulless voice boomed from all around them. Yes, Gabe said, not missing a beat. Choice confirmed. Wave begins in 18 Rits. Whoa! Slow down, man, Percy protested. Shouldn't you bring me up to speed before diving into a challenge? Gabe shrugged. What for? You said it yourself, your main body is only at orange. Unless you've possessed another green core with a fire affinity in the past, you won't be much help. Just let me handle this. Besides, time is too precious, and waiting is only going to worsen my condition. Wave begins in 12 Rits. Percy wasn't sure how long a Rit was. He estimated it was a little longer than a second, which meant they were running out of time. Fast. At least tell me you can handle this. Wave begins in 6 Rits. Probably. I was this close last time, but the attacks from the mini-bosses caught me by surprise. The injuries will make it harder, though. Gabe's words didn't sound particularly reassuring, but Percy had no choice but to trust him. Wave begins. May your challenge be successful. Chapter 75 Wings. A strange gelatinous liquid oozed out of the walls, the black droplets of sludge pooling at their base. Bulky appendages rose from the tar-like substance, before solidifying, making metallic groans as they pushed against the floor. An army of obsidian golems slowly took shape, pulling themselves out of the swamp, each of them as tall as a man. Their features became increasingly defined over time, a series of shallow indentations forming on their surface, before ultimately lighting up in a dim yellow color. Holy shit! How many do we need to fight at once? Percy asked. He lost count after 30. Plus, the dark liquid was still pouring down the sides of the cube, showing no sign of stopping anytime soon. The small ones aren't a problem. Those at green are the issue, Gabe replied. And just as he said that, Percy noticed a few larger silhouettes coming to life a couple rows back. Even while hunched over, they were twice as tall as the weaker variants, their long arms thicker than a tree's trunk. One of the giants took its first step forward, inadvertently crushing a smaller golem under its fist, a series of bright green inscriptions lighting up all over its smooth surface. The others soon followed, each of their strides sending a tremor through the floor. But Gabe was too preoccupied to worry about that right now. The first batch of yellow golems was already upon them. As for Percy, he understood he'd only get in his host's way, so he relaxed, relying on Gabe to handle them. And handle them he did. Before the nearest golem reached them, Gabe's core lit up, as Percy watched a torrent of blue mana gush through their transparent arms. A bright flash emerged from their palms, soon expanding into a fiery tornado, grinding against a dozen golems, their metallic frames melting like candles under the intense heat. Seemingly unconcerned about the devastation, more of the constructs walked into the hellish flames, only to share the grim fate of their predecessors. By the time the fire died out, over 20 golems had been reduced to a second puddle, surrounding Gabe like a donut. Unlike before, a red-hot sheen coated the substance, which showed no intention of returning to life. Neat. Percy was ecstatic. The spell was a lot fiercer than expected. Of course, it wasn't his first time seeing fire magic cast by a green core, but Gabe's flames looked different. Hotter too. He wanted to ask his host about it. However, he suppressed his bubbling curiosity, recognizing their situation was still dire. Gabe had used up a quarter of his reserves already, barely putting a dent in the swarm. Now what? You won't last if you keep going like this. Percy felt their lips part into a savage grin as the ambient mana flowed towards them. At first, he thought Gabe was trying to recover a little before the next batch reached them, but he soon noticed that wasn't it. The mana didn't enter their lungs, or whatever the equivalent organs were. Instead, it gathered on their back, the region below their shoulder blades heating up. A moment later, another flash blinded them, a blue light reflecting off the smooth walls of the cube. What the hell? Judging from its intensity, Percy guessed the new spell should have completely drained their core. However, he quickly noted he was wrong. It was still at 75%, not a single drop missing compared to a second ago. By the time the light died down, he realized they were hovering a few meters off the ground, a pair of wings flapping rhythmically behind them, holding them up. Are they fueled entirely out of ambient mana? How is that possible? Oblivious to Percy's questions, Gabe remained in that position a little longer, arrogantly staring down the golems below. Then he tilted his body, flapping his wings more violently than before, diving with great ferocity towards his enemies. He rolled in the air once, forming another fiery tornado, narrower but denser than the previous one. And boom! The blazing wings slammed down on the metallic floor, crushing and melting more of the golems, leaving a shallow dent on the ground. Percy felt one of their ethereal appendages crumble under the rough landing, but more ambient mana rushed to repair it. Not that Gabe gave it the chance. As he leapt towards the nearest golem, pivoting on his foot to spin, the half-formed wings slicing through it like butter. Suddenly, a tall silhouette loomed over them, its shadow blanketing their vision. The first green golem. It was here. Its massive fist descended, Gabe barely folding his one remaining wing at the last second, to shield their torso from the impact. Half of it was torn off as Gabe was sent sliding back. Their bare feet burned from the friction against the metal, the blood rolling in their chest, the blow having knocked the breath out of their lungs. Still, the wing had done its job, protecting them from any serious damage. And it was already recovering, as was the other one. A wet discharge escaped their lips, as Gabe wavered for a second. While his wing had endured the brunt of the blow, his previous injuries weren't doing him any favors. Still, he regained his bearing a moment later, throwing a quick glance around the room, scanning the army of golems as his gaze briefly lingered on the bigger ones, memorizing their locations. Then, he made use of his newly repaired wings, diving back towards the smaller constructs. Over the next several minutes, he methodically took them down one after another, this time making sure to avoid getting close to the taller variants. Things seemed to be going well too. A while later, he finished clearing out the cube without any further mishaps, leaving only the green golems standing. Luckily, they were too slow to catch up. The walls had stopped oozing sludge at some point too. What are we going to do about those? Percy wondered. As much as their situation had improved, he guessed the challenge wouldn't be over until they destroyed the rest. Suddenly, one of the giants stepped in a pool left over from its molten brethren. The construct raised its massive arms, stretching them towards Gabe. At the same time, black tar began flowing towards its bulky legs, visible bumps traveling up its body. More of the liquid accumulated in the outstretched limbs, as Percy watched them swell, in preparation for something nasty. Gabe was clearly expecting that, as he started running to a wall, circling a different golem to use its body as cover. But he was a moment too late. The golem's hands exploded into a rain of black needles, pelting their location, trying to rip them to shreds. Sparks flew wherever they landed, most of the projectiles bouncing off the smooth floor, as some pierced through, lodging themselves in place. Gabe raised his wing to block them, though it clearly wasn't going to last long. The burning appendage was already full of holes a second later, a couple shards having opened fresh wounds on their body. Luckily, they managed to make it behind the construct a moment later, prompting the other to cease firing. Just in time too, as the remaining two golems reached puddles of their own, preparing to join their comrade. This was how they got me last time, Gabe explained between pants. I didn't know they could do this, so I tried to stay airborne to buy time. I was forced to terminate the challenge as soon as they started firing, but the damage was already done. Percy shuddered, picturing 4 of the golems shooting at once. In any case, it was good they were better prepared, but that still didn't solve their immediate problem. Their cover was nothing more than another enemy. It was already slowly walking towards them, forcing them to step back, nearing the wall dangerously. They couldn't escape any other direction, as the other 3 were waiting for an opening to shoot. And to make matters worse, there was another puddle in the golem's path. As soon as it reached it, it would be able to unleash a barrage of its own. Thinking of something, Percy moved a trickle of soul mana to their eyes. Gabe raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything, letting his guests try this. Sadly, soul vision showed nothing. The constructs didn't have a soul he could target. In fact, they didn't have a mana core either. Apparently, they were powered entirely through their inscriptions, drawing mana from the cube. Any other brilliant ideas? Gabe asked. Nope. You're the one who said to leave it to you. Percy shot back. Whatever. I guess I'll have to hit them with everything I've got and hope it's enough. Percy thought there were more issues to solve than just offensive power. There was also the matter of endurance. Would their mana last for all 4 of the golems? Also, how would they reach the other 3 amidst the barrage of needles after losing their cover? But he remained quiet, not wanting to discourage his host before they even got through the first hurdle. Shrugging, Gabe ran towards the approaching golem, in a rush to intercept it before it stepped into the pool. A huge chunk of mana flowed out of his core, this time supplementing the ambient mana in his wings, causing them to burn even more fiercely than before. Gabe winced, as Percy felt the skin on their back blister from the heat. And a moment later, Gabe stepped in front of the construct, pivoting on his foot as a white-hot wing cleaved towards the golem like a giant axe. Chapter 76, Complications. The blazing spell made a grating sound as it clashed with the golem's fist, encountering far more resistance from the green construct than it had from its lesser brethren. Percy felt a sharp ache in their back, the torque threatening to rip the ethereal wing to shreds. But it held somehow, digging into the material inch by inch, the dark metal slowly parting under the burning blade. More ambient mana surged to repair the axe. Sadly, the same couldn't be said about Gabe's own mana, his core already dry. The wing gradually reverted to blue, much of its power gone. Gritting his teeth, Gabe didn't give up. With a final push, he sent the upper chunk of the golem's arm flying, before delivering a diagonal slash to its torso. The axe had lost a lot of its heat and momentum, but it still managed to dig halfway through the construct's chest before crumbling into wisps of blue. Exposed and at the golem's mercy, Percy braced for impact, fully expecting to get pounded to a pulp the very next second. Gabe must have thought the same as he closed his eyes, preparing for the worst. But nothing happened. They reluctantly opened their eyes to see the golem's colossal frame still looming over them, unmoving. The green lines on its surface were already dark. Holy shit! I thought we were done for, Percy said. His host only nodded in agreement. While they'd failed to bisect the golem as intended, the final slash had still been deep enough to put it out of commission. Yet, not giving them a chance to celebrate, the other 3 golems launched a joint round of fire, no longer concerned with the integrity of their fallen comrade. Gabe barely managed to use the golem's leg as cover, but the relentless needles were already eating into the metal. It wouldn't be long before they reached them, assuming the corpse didn't collapse on them first. Shit! Bring the wings back. We need them, Percy urged. Heeding his guest's advice, Gabe pulled the ambient mana once more, igniting a blue flame under his shoulders. Now what? Gabe asked. Push against the golem with your hands so it doesn't topple over. Wrap your wings around the leg to slow down the damage. And start taking deep breaths. Fast. Gabe's eyes widened in understanding as he followed the instructions. The golem's corpse was heavy, but they only needed to support a fraction of its weight to keep it balanced. Gabe was at green, so his physical strength was just about enough. The wings barely lasted a second against the torrent of shrapnel, but Gabe kept flooding them with ambient mana to buy more time. And with their situation temporarily stable, he inhaled, sending a trickle of mana into the empty core, slowly refilling it. Of course, this wasn't sustainable. At this rate, the leg would be eaten through, or the golem would crush them before the core was even halfway full. Percy was racking his brain for a plan when something changed. Suddenly, the cacophony of the metallic rain eased slightly, seemingly taking pity on their eardrums. What happened? He wondered. One of the golems must have run out of juice, Gabe guessed. Sure enough, a series of thunderous steps sent tremors through the floor as the giant started walking around the room, probably searching for another puddle to use as ammunition. This is our chance, Percy said. Are you crazy? There are still 2 of them shooting at us. We should wait until another one taps out. Gabe protested. What if the first one recovers by then? This might be our best shot. Percy felt their features twist into a grimace. Still, his host didn't argue back, likely agreeing with his logic. He pulled his wings, hiding them behind to let them recover, allowing the needles to grind through the leg faster. The half-eaten limb began to buckle as the golem's weight shifted, straining their arms dangerously. Their bones creaked and groaned, threatening to break within the next few seconds. Out of time, Gabe pushed some of his newly recovered mana into the wings, turning them white once more. A powerful flap sent him halfway across the cube, well on his way to the next golem. He'd aimed for the one not shooting at them, roughly estimating its location by the sound of its steps. The other 2 quickly turned to him, as Gabe split his mana between the wings, using one to shield himself from the projectiles while aiming the other downward. The golem barely raised its arm in time, but Gabe's momentum allowed him to slice right through it. His axe carved vertically into the construct, splitting its head down the middle before fizzling out at the base of its neck. And just like that, the second golem was dead, Percy and Gabe finding themselves behind new cover. Cool. Let's stick with this tactic, Percy said. Their core was empty again, but with one less golem shooting at them, they had more time. Reforming the wings, Gabe hid behind a leg, coating it in a layer of blue flames. Then he inhaled, or tried to. It was only then they realized they hadn't escaped unscathed. The adrenaline had masked the pain, but now they noticed several needles had penetrated through their defenses. Plenty were sticking out of their body, their left side resembling a porcupine. Worst of all was a shard deeply lodged in their lung, making it much harder to recover mana. Percy was momentarily unsettled by the alien taste in his mouth. The flavor was metallic, but, unlike the sweet undertone of iron, it left a hint of bitterness lingering at the back of his throat. Damn, you have to push through it, or we're done for, he grimly told his host. They couldn't damage the remaining golems with the wings alone. Without Gabe's own mana empowering the spell, they had no hope of cutting through the hard material. Gabe nodded. Each breath hurt, and with only one functioning lung, it took way longer to gather mana. Still, thanks to the weakened barrage, they eventually managed to refill half their core. Percy was ecstatic when another of the golems ran out of juice, though he couldn't help but frown a moment later. His host wasn't moving. What are you doing? Go, he urged again. No reply. Only then did Percy notice Gabe's condition had grown critical. By now, they'd lost a ton of blood, and their vision was blurry. His host lacked the strength to execute the maneuver. I don't think I can, the latter said weakly. While he had made it look easy, Percy understood it took a lot of focus to combine the 2 sources of mana. Reshaping the wings into weapons probably required some effort too. What if I take over the ambient mana? Can you do the rest by yourself? He asked. He still had no idea why Gabe had this ability, but he'd observed him long enough to figure out how to keep it going. That could work, but we won't be able to fly. Takes a lot of practice. Just focus on maintaining the wings and run towards the golem. I'll take it from there. Without missing a beat, Gabe relinquished control of the ambient mana, passing the reins to his guest. It was a somewhat novel experience for Percy, but he quickly realized it felt vaguely familiar. It's a bit like when I create my clones. Are the wings Gabe's bloodline? I thought those were exclusive to Remier, but he shook the distracting thoughts out of his head. This wasn't the time. Gabe soon added his own mana to the wings, reshaping them into a white shield and axe, as Percy sprinted towards the next target. More shards dug into the wing, but with only one golem shooting, the damage was more bearable. Once they reached the construct, Gabe swung the tattered wing to brush its fist aside, before slashing at its neck with the other one. Its head landed heavily a couple meters away, as its inscriptions dimmed, making this one of their cleanest kills yet. Plopping down, Gabe rested against the leg, not even bothering to coat it with his wings this time. It would take the last golem ages to pierce through the cover by itself, letting them concentrate on recovering. Every time one of them was on the verge of passing out, the other shook him awake, as they waited for the construct to exhaust the liquid pool by its feet. And finally, after what felt like forever, the golem stopped shooting. Not in a rush to exacerbate their wounds, they casually strolled towards it, delivering one last strike, ending the challenge. "Wow, we actually did it," Percy said. "Are you sure we can get healed now?" "We'd better. We should be eligible for more than that," Gabe replied, before falling to his knees. Suddenly, the symbols all over the room lit up, as the cube started repairing itself. The remains of the golems, both the small and large variants, all liquefied, seeping into the floor. Even the shards sticking out of their body melted, trickling down their skin, as more of Gabe's clear blood gushed out of the wounds. Couldn't they be a little gentler?" Percy groaned. A few seconds later, every last drop of sludge had disappeared, the cube's surfaces having reverted to their former condition, with no sign of the previous dents and scratches. "Congratulations! Wave 6 has been cleared. Calculating rewards." The soulless voice was back. "Awarded credits, 6,000. Current balance, 28563. Wave 6 is a special milestone. Bonus reward is available. Please voice your request. Note: bonus reward is limited to the green grade. I want my body healed up completely." Gabe strained himself to speak. Evaluating request. "My goal was to ask for a tome on fire magic. I'm working on improving my spell. Such a pity to waste it on healing. Oh well, I suppose the tome won't do me much good if I'm dead," Gabe explained. However, Percy didn't pay him any attention. He was busy thinking about something else. It was only now he realized their recovery might be riddled with complications. Evaluation complete. The request falls well within the parameters of your reward. The excess value will be converted to credits. Accumulating life mana. Healing begins in 6 writs. And that about confirmed Percy's fears. Shit. Chapter 77 Decree. Multiple green symbols lit up underneath their feet. Together, they formed an intricate circle, woven out of the same script decorating the rest of the cube. Gazing up, Percy noticed a similar shape forming on the ceiling right above them, as a beautiful gem glistened in its center. It fell, flying through the air like a verdant droplet, before landing on their forehead. The liquid was cool to the touch, swiftly seeping into their skin. Percy felt an itch snaking down through their body, as cuts and scrapes closed in its wake, the pain fading a moment later. By the time its effect was exhausted, all the injuries above their chest had healed entirely, the discomfort replaced by a gentle chill. Only then did they look up again, watching a second droplet about to coalesce. However, things didn't go so smoothly this time. As the soothing sensation lingered in their torso, latching itself to some of the many wounds marring it, something else stirred inside their body. "Ah, there it is," Percy grimaced, An all too familiar vortex awakened right around their abdomen, exerting an attractive force on the mana. At first it was weak, unable to sway the substance off its path. But it was nothing if not persistent. The pull kept intensifying until a trickle was finally pried from the wounds. And the very moment the mana reached its new home, all hell broke loose. While the minuscule snack wasn't remotely sufficient to satiate the vortex's hunger, it was more than enough to fully whet its appetite. The force instantly quadrupled in strength, as the rest of the mana was violently snatched from its original purpose. "What's going on?" Gabe asked, only now registering something was wrong. "Well, now we pray this cube of yours isn't cheap enough to skimp on your reward," Percy said, knowing there was no stopping what was about to occur. The third droplet barely landed on their head, before getting sucked right into their abdomen. But the inscriptions appeared too proud to accept their loss, tossing more life mana at their patient, trying to outmatch their new competitor. Little did they know that it was only getting started. The new droplets were gone as soon as they landed. The inscriptions were enraged. They blinked furiously for several seconds, before rapidly expanding. They didn't stop until their diameter had doubled. More mana accumulated inside the circle on the ceiling, but it didn't fall just yet. This time, it waited, gathering more and more of the syrupy liquid, a viscous blob swelling to fill the entire shape. "Oh boy, I suggest you take a deep breath," Percy advised his host. Luckily, the hole in their lung was one of the few injuries the first couple of droplets had managed to reach. It wasn't completely healed, but it didn't hurt as much when Gabe inhaled. And he was just in time too. Having gathered enough fluid, the inscription finally let go of the monstrous blob, as the mother of all droplets rapidly enlarged in Percy's vision. It was heavy, but not enough to knock a green core off his feet. The sound was strangely muted too, as the liquid instantly wrapped around their body, hugging it tightly. It seeped through every orifice and pore, desperate to do its job before it got consumed. But the vortex never gave it the chance. Almost as if it knew its tasty feast would end the moment the healing was complete, it stubbornly devoured every single hint of mana, much to Gabe's growing frustration. Worse still, the liquid blocked his air canals, making it impossible to breathe. Gabe didn't seem to appreciate the minty taste in his mouth either, clawing the bubble out of his face. Sadly for him, more flowed to replace it. "Give up. It won't stop until it's done," Percy explained. Much like the crimson fluid back in Phoebe's temple, it was far denser than anything a mortal could produce. This was clearly a god's mana, and just like back then, the liquid had been in storage for who knew how long. The will of its original owner had long dissipated, rendering it powerless to resist the gluttonous vortex. "It's a good thing. Well, assuming it leaves enough mana for you to heal afterwards," Percy said. But Gabe didn't seem convinced. He kept squirming, desperate to shake the substance off. At some point, he even tried summoning his wings, but the bubble blocked the flow of ambient mana. "Conserve your breath. It's going to be over soon." This was Percy's third attempt at placating his host. Out of options, the latter finally paid attention. "How soon?" Gabe asked. "Hopefully before we suffocate." Percy shrugged. Resigning to his fate, Gabe sat cross-legged, letting the vortex enjoy its meal. And indeed, the flow died down about a minute later. Freed at last, what remained of the liquid returned to its original job, though only a fraction was necessary to complete their recovery. The rest, they had to expel the good old way, as the circle on the floor drained whatever mana reached it. Before they were even done spitting out the leftovers, the cube spoke once more. "Healing complete. Calculating excess value. Excess value. Minus 2,432. Deducting credits. New balance. 26131. What the hell? Wanna explain what just happened? Why take credit instead of adding credit? What did you do?" Gabe yelled. "Geez, calm down. It's because you used up way more life mana than you were meant to. But I promise you, you got your money's worth." Percy felt their brow crease. "How so?" "It's easier to show you," Percy said, pulling up his status, though he got interrupted before even reading halfway through. Gabriel, Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Green. Fire. Mana core 2. Yellow. Ew. Wow. You never mentioned you're a Morai, Gabe exclaimed. Oh? You've heard of them? Percy asked back. Who hasn't? Well, Mickey hadn't. Then again, the gladiator hadn't been privy to much gossip from inside his damp cell. The rest of the places Percy had visited hadn't been much better. However, this world seemed even more developed than Remir, so it wasn't that surprising Gabe was better informed. I'm not a Morai. I just snatched their thing, much like how I passed it over to you, he said. You're kidding, right? His host asked. Why is it so hard to believe? Percy shrugged. You're telling me you managed to steal the Morai's decree from under their noses? Percy raised an eyebrow. Decree? What's that? A wave of shock reached him through their connection. You don't even know that. It's only the highest tier of spells in the entire universe. The Holy Grail of magic, Gabe explained enthusiastically. He remained silent for a couple seconds, before adding, learning to cast one marks the difference between a regular god and a titan. Percy's eyes widened. He'd never come across this tidbit of information in his studies. It seemed the Divine Order didn't publicize everything. Then, was that the secret behind the mysterious section in his status? Did it list all the decrees affecting him? One of them was what granted him the ability to view his status in the first place. Was that a decree in and of itself? Plus, Phoebe was a Titaness, and she clearly had a connection to the status and the affinity tests. Was it her decree? Then what about the one granting him a bloodline? Who did that come from? All those were things he'd have to investigate when he returned to Remir. For now, his best course of action was to learn as much as possible from his host. What's so special about them anyway? He couldn't help but ask. Gabe gasped, seemingly taken aback by his question. Almost offended, even. Decrees differ from the lower tiers of magic in two major ways, he said. First, they are self-sustaining, meaning their effect persists without any conscious effort from their caster. Even if the Titan in question dies, the decree remains active. Percy was already shocked but didn't interrupt. The most important characteristic, however, is that a decree is powerful enough to affect an entire world, changing it forever. For the next few minutes, Percy pondered the implications. Indeed, all the decrees he had come across fit the criteria. Every person on Remir had access to a status and the chance to inherit a bloodline. And the same was true for the Morai, all of them born with a second core. Decrees were truly world-altering. I understand, he eventually replied, but his host shook his head. You really don't, Gabe said before elaborating. Every time a new Titan emerges, they grant their world a permanent advantage. Naturally, all decrees are impressive. That said, not all of them are created equal. What do you mean? Percy frowned. Some aren't as rare or powerful as others. For example, we have one granting us a bloodline in this world. It basically lets us inherit some unique ability from our parents. That's a common type. Many worlds have something similar, though the exact details may vary slightly. Percy nodded. He had already suspected Gabe's wings to be a bloodline. Unaware of his thoughts, the latter continued. The one which lets you view information about yourself is relatively widespread too, though we don't have that here. Then, I take it the Morai's decree is on the more valuable end of the spectrum? Percy asked. That's quite the understatement. You can't even fathom how many different gods have tried to recreate it. But the circumstances under which it came to be are almost impossible to replicate. From what I've heard, only one faction has ever come close, yet even their version is but a pale imitation, ridden with drawbacks. Once again, Percy came to appreciate just how lucky that first clone of his had been. Of all the places in the universe, it had ended up in quite the spot. He grinned, before turning to his host again. Congratulations are in order then. I thought you'd be happier with your new toy. Chapter 78, Blessing. You mean I get to keep this after you're gone? Gabe asked. I imagine so, assuming you survive. After all, it's already taken root inside your body. Though it's hard to say for sure. I've never come this far with one of my hosts. Percy replied. Gabe frowned. But I don't feel any different. That's because it's still inactive. As soon as you fill it up for the first time, you'll experience an all-around improvement, not unlike a promotion. If we're lucky, it might even help us fix your soul. Its effect should be significant too, since it's only 1 grade lower than your first core. Saying that, Percy felt a little envious of his new pal. Why did Gabe's second core start off at yellow, when he had to climb from the very bottom? Are you a yellow-born by any chance? Gabe nodded absent-mindedly, apparently lost in thought. Confirming his guess, Percy wasn't very happy. All 3 of his data points suggested one's second core began at the same grade as their first. It meant Mickey's would be red too. In any case, that was his main body's problem. Right now, his job was to make the most of his time here. Thinking of something, he turned to Gabe again. How do you guys discover your affinity? It should be more complicated without a status or Phoebe's tests. How else? If it's not a common element, we buy a book on rare affinities and find which one matches. Okay, that didn't sound very difficult. Percy couldn't help but wonder why they didn't have books like that back on Remier. Then again, all the important people got tested for free. Besides, listing their grades and affinities was nothing more than a convenience. The main purpose of the status was to help them develop their spells. Shrugging, he pulled Gabe's information again, eager to read the rest. Gabriel, Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Green. Fire. Mana core 2. Yellow. Ew. Bloodline. Wings. Create a pair of wings fueled by ambient mana. Effect varies by affinity. Blessing. Blessing of heat. Produce hotter flames. Spells. Parting gift, crude. Decrees. Phoebe's decree. Grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. Morai's decree. Grants a second mana core. Most of it was as expected. Percy was happy his new understanding of decrees was reflected in his status. It might not seem like a big deal that a couple of question marks had been replaced by words, but it was massive. He now knew what to look for during his travels. After all, these divine perks were some of the most valuable things he could obtain. What shocked him the most, however, was the blessing. It finally explained the odd color and increased potency of his host's flames. But that wasn't what surprised Percy. He didn't need to ask what a blessing was, as they actually had them back on Remier. No, what left him flabbergasted was what it implied about Gabe's heritage. You're the son of a god? It was the only way to obtain a blessing. A god's offspring wasn't much different from a mortal's. Their grade, affinity, and bloodline were still determined based on the same rules as everyone else's, and with the same rates. Their only advantage was the chance of inheriting a blessing. For that to happen, they needed to share the affinity of their divine parent, and, even then, it wasn't guaranteed. If they got lucky enough to inherit one, it essentially allowed them to passively tap into one of the concepts their parent had mastered, permanently empowering their magic. In Gabe's case, it turned his flames hotter, but that wasn't the only blessing one could inherit from a fire god. Somebody else might have flames that spread more easily or lasted longer. Each element was associated with multiple concepts, though a mortal could only ever possess a single blessing. It's not a big deal. Nearly everyone in our world has at least one divine parent. We mortals are forbidden from procreating amongst ourselves. The revelation left Percy flabbergasted. What? Why? Gabe shrugged. I suppose it's about time I told you what sort of place you found yourself on, since you don't seem to have the slightest clue. Welcome to the Vault of Magic, the largest artificial world in the cosmos. Artificial. Gabe sighed. Let me explain on the way to my place. It's been a long day, considering I died and everything. Gabe walked to a wall, as a few symbols shined brighter, forming the outline of a square. SSSS. By the time he reached it, a burst of steam spewed out of its edges, the thick slab of metal sinking into the floor, allowing them to leave the room. The sight outside was unlike anything Percy had ever seen. They found themselves inside an even bigger cube, this one downright colossal. Its sides were so far away they appeared blurry, the walls taller than mountains. The top of the room was closed too, the ceiling akin to a sky of gray metal. Countless inscriptions decorated the structure's surfaces like stars. Percy spotted many of the smaller cubes around him, similar to the one they just exited. A few people queued up in front of each, probably waiting for their turn to start a challenge. Gabe ignored them as he began walking. This place started off as a small research facility. Our founder, Metatron, was a god who abandoned his original world, having grown tired of the wars and politics. His only wish was to uncover the secrets of magic. Anything else he viewed as a distraction. Over the next few minutes, Gabe explained the vault's history to Percy. Apparently, this Metatron possessed a space affinity and was pretty good with it too. He originally hid the vault in some remote corner of the universe. Finding it was no easy task, and even the few times it was spotted, it hadn't been too difficult to move it elsewhere. Away from everyone, the god was free to continue his research in peace, spending countless millennia holed up in his humble abode. Eventually, something changed. At some point, Metatron grew powerful enough to finally cast a decree, making him the vault's first titan. It allowed him to grant others access to the vault, letting them open a portal to the artificial world from anywhere across the universe. That moment marked the beginning of the vault's rapid expansion. Through the decree, it was possible to recruit more gods without compromising the world's safety. After all, they could enter it even while it was hidden or on the move. The portals were one-way too, so it was much easier to join than leave. Not that it was impossible for a god to exit if they really wanted, but that was beside the point. Even then, they wouldn't necessarily know the location of the vault, and by the time they had the chance to betray Metatron, he would have long moved it elsewhere and revoked their access. "It's ingenious," Percy said. "Yes." Gabe nodded. Giving people the ability to open a portal isn't as direct a boon as a bloodline or second core. Not exactly what comes to mind when you think of a decree. Still, its impact is undeniable. It functioned as an extra layer of security, allowing the vault to become what it is today. Of course, that was not to say Metatron didn't vet his peers the good old way too. He had to use all the means at his disposal, both mundane and magical, since many of them came from shady backgrounds. Some were criminals exiled from their own worlds. Many were refugees with nowhere to go after their homes were destroyed or conquered. Only a few were researchers at heart, sharing his own passion for magic. Well, that certainly explains the diversity of races here, Percy noted. On their way to his host's house, they saw people of all sorts. They ranged from Gabe's own species to hulking humanoids twice his height with 2 horns sticking out their temples. There were even some green-skinned folks with pointy ears who barely reached his knees, scurrying about like kids. The gods didn't start having children until much later, though. Gabe explained. Through all his security measures, Metatron had ensured the vault's safety, as more and more gods joined. Many of them brought new knowledge with them, helping him upgrade and expand the artificial world, until it became the marvel of magical technology it was today. Of course, it still paled in comparison to a natural world, in both size and content. Though they did eventually manage to implement a habitat that could support a larger population of mortals. But that still doesn't explain why you have this weird rule about procreating, Percy said. That's because you have yet to understand what we are to our parents. Gabe chuckled bitterly. They reached another cube much larger than the one they had undergone the challenge in. Gabe pressed his hand on its surface, as a circle lit up around it. SSSS. A moment later, the metal parted like before, letting them inside. Gabe walked through a relatively narrow corridor. It was wide enough for them, but Percy guessed the horned creatures would probably have to crouch to fit. Every time they came across a resident, they had to squeeze against the walls to pass each other. Percy didn't miss the faint square indentations tightly packed along the walls, guessing they were probably doors. Several corridors and flights of stairs later, They eventually stopped before one, pressing their hand on its cold surface once more. Gabe's room was tiny. It was actually smaller than Mickey's cell on Hue Hue. There was a bed barely large enough for him. Right next to it, there was a toilet and a shower, with nothing but a thin glass panel to shield the rest of the room from the moisture. We are not products of love. We aren't even treated as people. Our parents only see us as a resource for their experiments. Chapter 79, Natural Selection. Experiments? What could gods possibly gain from us mortals? Percy raised an eyebrow. Lots of things, actually. Gabe shrugged. The most obvious benefit is getting more people to ascend to godhood, expanding their ranks. While the chances of any one child reaching divinity were laughably minuscule, it was ultimately a numbers game, especially for immortal beings who could keep pumping out kids for millennia on end. But that's just a matter of luck, isn't it? Percy asked. Gabe shook his head. It's true a child's grade is random, which means it's not possible to control the emergence of new gods directly. However, an indirect solution is to simply have children more often. Having more kids means you need more space to house them, and more food to feed them. How is that sustainable? It's not. At least, not if you care about what happens to the failures. Percy's eyes widened. Resource management was a problem all worlds had to deal with. That said, it was even more pronounced in the Vault of Magic, due to its smaller size and barren environment. Consequently, it could only support a small number of mortals. This meant the gods had to be a lot more deliberate when choosing which of their kids to keep around. Cube. I wish to purchase one portion of Sizian meat. User ID 004527945512. Gabe suddenly said. Authorization granted. One portion of Sizian meat is valued at 1 credit. Current balance 26131. Proceed with purchase. The soulless voice answered again, as the colorful symbols blinked along the room's walls. Yes, Gabe said. Confirmed. Deducting credits. New balance 26130. Delivery in 6 writs. Percy couldn't help but wonder what happened if one tried using somebody else's ID. Though he seriously doubted the gods in charge had been dumb enough to overlook such a glaring loophole. SSS. A small circular hole opened in the ceiling a few seconds later, before an amber object fell on the bed. What's that? Percy asked. Lunch, Gabe said before picking it up. The alien snack was irregularly shaped and about as large as Gabe's fist. Taking a bite, Percy quickly noticed its texture was rough, its taste bitter. Between this and the spoilt rodent meat he'd eaten back on Hue Hue, he couldn't help but reevaluate the food they had on Remir. His world might be far from perfect, but if there was one thing he couldn't complain about was their cuisine. At least, he'd yet to stumble upon anything on par with Freddy's honey rolls during his travels. Now I'm confused. Is this your food, or how you cleanse your cores? Percy asked. Both, Gabe replied before elaborating. As you can imagine, the vault can't exactly support a diverse ecosystem, so the gods in charge had to carefully choose what flora and fauna to cultivate. They ended up importing Sizians, which are a bunch of reptiles that store beast mana in their flesh. It makes their meat both nutritious and, after some processing, suitable for core purification, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But isn't it expensive? What about those who can't afford the advancement? Percy asked in protest. They starve, making space for more people, Gabe said. Percy grimaced in disgust. What sort of monsters would treat their children like that? It's even worse than you think. They make us fight for our food. The challenges are the only way to earn credits. But Redborns and Orangeborns can't keep up with their needs. Why? Do those bastards get off watching you struggle? It's not for entertainment. You see, they don't just want to increase the quantity of new gods. They want to improve their quality too. The bloodlines? Gabe nodded. In the context of the vault, and even Remir, one of the most important factors influencing the quality of a god was whether they had a powerful bloodline or not. After all, bloodline abilities had all sorts of weird effects, often letting one do things even gods couldn't otherwise replicate. Percy himself was a prime example of this. So, while a bloodline wasn't a requirement for divinity, a god who had one was generally stronger than one who didn't. Yes, everyone born under yellow is left to starve, while the rest of us are thrown into challenges to test our bloodlines. The ones who make it further are granted the honor of mating with our own parents to create the next generation of children. That way, they maximize the odds of breeding people with both a blessing and a powerful bloodline. On one hand, the challenges are there to motivate us, since we'd starve or fail to advance without them. On the other, there are opportunity to develop unique spells, revealing which bloodlines are worth keeping in the process, weeding out the weaklings. Percy remained silent for a while, contemplating the implications. Strictly speaking, Remir's gods weren't much better than this. True, they didn't treat lowborns nearly as badly, and they also didn't sleep around to spread their blessings all over the place. That said, their approach to bloodlines was more or less the same. The constant war rampant between the noble houses was clearly something that suited the divine order. After all, it would only take Phoebe a word to stop it, since nobody would dare oppose her. In other words, letting Remir's nobles continue killing each other was their version of the challenges. To keep recycling the population, allowing more gods to emerge and powerful bloodlines to mutate. Though even those at the bottom can still have some semblance of a life there. Percy thought. By comparison, the vault's deities were downright cruel, treating their own offspring as nothing but livestock. Well, as much as we all hate their guts, I guess I can't argue with the results. Gabe shrugged. Indeed, Percy's latest host was clearly one of the lucky ones, having inherited the full package. You still died though, didn't you? He couldn't help but point out. I suppose, Gabe said, before adding, now that you bring that up, what are we going to do about it? You did promise to help, right? Like I said, this is a long shot, though I guess it's been going well for us so far. Percy replied, meaning that healing your body did greatly slow your soul's deterioration. It's still a mess, but between your second core and my stashed mana, we have a lot more time than I previously thought. Percy felt a wave of hope inadvertently seeping through their connection, but Gabe quickly quashed it. I sense a but coming, the latter said. But it's not a permanent solution. You need a lot more soul mana than I have left for a decent shot at a complete and rapid recovery. And I guess only a god's mana is dense enough to be stored for a long period of time. He explained. Naturally, Percy wasn't certain about that last part, but all his experiences seemed to corroborate that deduction. Seriously? Gabe was flustered, and rightfully so. While life and soul affinities were both categorized as rare, the former were much more common than the latter. The Vault of Magic clearly possessed at least one god with a life affinity willing to donate some of his mana. However, there was no guarantee they had what Gabe needed. Is it impossible to get any? Percy asked. I don't know. Even if we have it, and that's a big if, it's definitely in the restricted lists. You can't buy a god's mana with credits alone, otherwise we wouldn't have had to go through that challenge to fix my body in the first place. The only way is to get another bonus reward. So, Percy didn't understand what the problem was. It should be easier to complete another challenge now that you're healed. But Gabe shook his head. You don't understand. You only earn a bonus reward every 6 waves. The Swarm Challenge is the one I'm best at, because my wings essentially grant me unlimited endurance. Even then, it took everything I had to clear wave 6. The next reward is at 12. Percy swallowed hard. He had no idea how the difficulty scaled, but he couldn't help but picture an army of green golems like the ones from earlier surrounding them. What about the other challenges? He asked. There are only 2 more types. The Magiscript Challenge doesn't involve any combat, but nobody under blue bothers learning the art, as it takes decades to make any progress. Right now, I couldn't place down a single glyph to save my life. And that's just the red version of the challenge. The green one involves much more complicated inscriptions. You can only earn rewards for your own grade. Gabe said. As much as Percy would have loved to dip his toes into the field, he didn't argue back. Not only had he promised Gabe he'd try saving him, they also didn't have enough time for this. Even with their newly repaired body, he estimated they'd last a month or two at most. And the other one? He asked. The Gauntlet Challenge is admittedly the only one we might stand a chance at. Still, beating the third wave was tough. I can't see myself clearing 3 more, especially since the last one will be on a whole different level. It definitely sounded like a tall order, but Percy wasn't one to give up easily. Then, I guess we'll have to be on a whole different level too. Chapter 80 Preparations. Evaluating Request. Are you sure there is no other way? Gabe asked. Hey, don't complain. Tattoos might hide the core from mana sense, but people would still be able to see it through your skin. And you obviously can't wear a shirt either due to your wings. Percy replied. Before they could begin filling up Gabe's second core, they needed to ensure it was concealed. Based on what Percy had come to learn about the Vault of Magic, the last thing they needed were the gods in charge finding out such a juicy specimen had fallen in their grasp. Of course, Percy had inadvertently left plenty of evidence of his presence already. Whether it was Gabe's miraculous survival or the extraordinary amount of life mana they had used up. Adding all the things they were planning to do over the next few weeks, the cat was already halfway out of the bag. Though most of it couldn't be avoided, they could at least take care of the rest. Evaluation complete. Custom item is valued at 37 credits. Current balance, 26130. Proceed with purchase? The soulless voice asked. Percy felt Gabe's heartache through the connection. I get it, but does it have to be so expensive? He groaned. It doesn't seem like a lot. It will barely put a dent in your balance. Percy said. That's because it hasn't been too long since I reached green. I still have most of my rewards from the fresh batch of challenges. Gabe explained. But I have to be mindful when spending them. Getting more won't be easy. Percy nodded in understanding. It should indeed be the case that a resident of the vault earned the majority of their resources shortly after advancing. The first few waves in each grade shouldn't be too difficult, though Gabe was already struggling to climb much further. His current credits would have to last him all the way to blue, which was presumably several decades away. Just do it. Or would you rather some god cut you open on an operating table? Gabe grumbled some more, but he ultimately acquiesced. Yes, he spoke. Confirmed. Deducting credits. New balance, 26093. Delivery in 900 writs. Percy raised an eyebrow. That should be over 15 minutes. A lot longer than that piece of meat had needed. Then again, the latter was probably an off-the-shelf product they had plenty of in stock. As for the object they just requested, it would have to be manufactured on the spot. All things considered, it was already quite impressive the vault system could accomplish the task at all, let alone in such short notice. A testament to their advanced technology. Soon enough, a circular hole opened on the ceiling once more, before the requested object landed on the bed. It was a rolled-up strip of cloth, cut out of an exquisite midnight blue fabric, densely covered in embroidered symbols a few shades lighter. Percy picked it up, noting it was still quite warm, probably because it was fresh out the oven. It was soft to the touch, made of the finest silk he'd ever come across. Next, he unraveled it, marveling at the intricate script decorating it. This bandage was both thinner and much shorter than his own, which only served to drive home the insurmountable gap between the vault's enchanters and Remiers. A quick tug revealed it was also somewhat flexible, yet still strong. It wouldn't be an issue if it had to stretch a little, and it was unlikely to tear easily. In any case, Percy couldn't help but study the runes a little longer. Due to all his secrets, it would serve him well to learn how to craft this type of enchantment by himself. Gabe didn't bother him either, letting him concentrate for a few minutes, probably a gesture of goodwill, considering how much Percy had done for him already. Still, the latter didn't get very far. He had to begrudgingly give up after failing to understand anything. His host clearly hadn't lied when he said Magiscript was a demanding field. Not letting this get to him too much, Percy wrapped the bandage around their abdomen a couple of times, before tying the loose ends behind their back. They're all done, I think. Between the cube being stingy with the fabric and his host's transparent skin, The core was barely concealed, but it would have to do. How do I explain it? Gabe asked. For the first couple of months, I could wrap a regular bandage on top and claim I was injured, but people will eventually start wondering why it's taking so long to heal. Sorry, but I'll be gone by then. You'll have to figure that part out by yourself. For the time being, I suggest you focus on actually surviving until then. Percy replied. Fair enough. So, what's the plan? Percy thought about it for a while before speaking. Let me handle your second core for now. It took me about a week to get mine filled up, but I'm sure I can do it even faster this time around. Without wasting a moment, he activated Mana Sense, looking inward for the new organ. His host's physiology was different to his own, but Percy was a bit of an expert in locating cores and mana channels in all sorts of alien bodies by now. What should I do in the meantime? Gabe asked. Can you dig up any information the vault has on the Morai? Ever since he obtained his second core, Percy had been winging it, mostly using his two affinities independently of one another. However, he couldn't shake the feeling he was missing out on something important. An entire culture of people with two cores should have developed some more esoteric arts to fully exploit them. Yet Percy had never had the opportunity to learn them before now. Cube, what do you have on the Morai? Also, while you're at it, check if you have any soul mana stored. User ID 004527945512. Gabe said. Authorization granted. Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. There are 452 books, 1121 research logs, 9 encyclopedias and 32,653 news reports that mention Morai. Part of the selection is restricted for your grade. Only 321 books, 354 research logs, 6 encyclopedias and 7,564 news reports are available for purchase. Total cost, 35,431 credits. Current balance, 26093. The response elicited different reactions from Percy and Gabe. The former couldn't help but rub his hands. He wanted to purchase everything and make his host binge Reddit, but he knew that wasn't realistic. As for the latter, the shocking price nearly gave him a heart attack. But the cube wasn't done quite yet. Evaluation complete. Soul mana is listed on the restricted section for green grade. It is only available through a bonus reward. As expected, they still had to work through the challenge, though it was nice to have confirmation the mana actually existed. Try filtering out the fluff? Percy suggested, returning to the previous item. Gabe hesitated for a moment, probably thinking it would still be more than he'd be willing to pay, but ultimately heeded Percy's request. Get rid of anything on the Morai's world, politics, history, and geography. Only leave behind things related directly to their magic. Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. There are 78 books, 185 research logs, 2 encyclopedias and 67 news reports available for purchase. Total cost, 6,597 credits. Current balance, 26093. That did seem to cut out a lot of encyclopedias and news reports, but not as many research logs, which frankly made sense. Still, it was way too pricey. Ignore everything relevant only to gods or specific affinities and bloodlines. Focus on general information about how the average Morai mortal uses their two cores. Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. There are 24 books, 93 research logs, 0 encyclopedias and 67 news reports available for purchase. Total cost, 2,597 credits. Current balance, 26093. It's still way too much. Besides, we don't have enough time to read all that. Gabe said. Percy creased their brow. Why do I feel you're leaving out something? Look, it's possible to request the system to summarize the information, compiling it into a much shorter document while getting rid of redundancies. It will add a charge for the service, though it should also give us a discount due to the eliminated information. That said, I doubt it's going to end up below 2,000 credits. Gabe explained. Hearing that, Percy wanted nothing more than to slap his host. He only held himself back because he knew it would hurt him too. No, you stingy piece of shit, he fired back. I'm doing my best to save your ass here, and you're skimping on me over a bunch of credits. Hey, I have to think about my life after you're gone too, Gabe replied. What's there to think about? I gave you a second core. You'll live twice as long and clear plenty more waves with it. A couple thousand credits are the least you can invest. You'll make them back in no time. Percy didn't let up, but his host shook his head. I'll also need twice as much Scythian meat as before. It's not as simple as you make it sound. Well, that was true. Also, Percy would be lying if he said he wasn't thinking about himself too. Still, he firmly believed this was in Gabe's best interest. The credits wouldn't matter if they failed to fix his soul. Plus, Percy genuinely thought the insight contained in those books would pay for itself. Gabe, the system has already confirmed it contains the soul mana you need. And you've admitted you can't get to the next bonus reward as you are. We need to get you a lot stronger in a short amount of time. At the end of the day, it's your money and your life, but if you ask me, you'll have to take a gamble. Gabe remained silent for a few seconds, considering his options. Fine.